Hey guys, tonight we're drifting back through thousands of years to answer a question that's surprisingly hard to pin down. When did people actually start smoking weed? You might picture hazy college dorms or Woodstock fields, but the truth reaches so much further into the past that it touches civilizations you've only glimpsed in history books. You're about to walk alongside nomads who inhaled sacred smoke in felt tents, physicians who ground cannabis into healing powders, and poets who praised its effects in verses that still survive. The story may solve mysteries you never had an explanation for, like why this single plant appears in ancient medical texts from China to Persia, or how it traveled across continents long before modern trade routes existed. So before you explore the story with me, please take a moment to help me subscribe to the channel, like and share this video, or maybe leave a comment below, but make sure you do it when you really like what I bring to you. Maybe tell me where you are right now as you listen, whether you're tucked under blankets in Ohio or watching the sunrise in Melbourne, or share a moment when history surprised you, when a fact turned everything you thought you knew upside down. Your words fuel this journey as much as the research does. Now, let's keep the lights as soft as possible. Turn on the fan for a gentle sound to help the story feel more emotional, and let's embark on tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing on a windswept plateau in the Altai Mountains, where modern-day Russia, China, Mongolia, and Kazakhstan meet in a knot of ancient borderlands. The year is somewhere around 3000 BCE, though calendars don't exist yet and time moves by seasons, not seconds. Beneath your feet, the soil hides something archaeologists won't discover for 5,000 years. Charred seeds, fragments of braziers, and burnt wooden tools that once heated cannabis flowers until they released their smoke. This is one of humanity's earliest proven encounters with inhaled cannabis, a practice so old it predates the pyramids of Egypt by centuries. You crouch beside a reconstructed fire pit, imagining the people who gathered here. They weren't casual users stumbling onto a high. They were likely shamans or community leaders conducting rituals that bonded their tribes to the spirit world. The cannabis they burned wasn't the domesticated high THC strains you'd recognize today. It was wild hemp, scraggly and resilient, growing in disturbed soils along migration paths and riverbeds. Yet even wild cannabis contains enough psychoactive compounds to alter consciousness when concentrated through burning, and these ancient peoples learned that secret through experimentation you can only guess at. Did someone accidentally toss a cannabis plant into a cooking fire and notice the strange euphoric effects? Did they observe animals grazing on the leaves and acting oddly? Historians still argue whether the discovery was accident or intention, but the evidence is clear. By the Bronze Age, people were deliberately using cannabis to change their mental state. The Altai region wasn't the only place where this relationship began. You turn your attention southeast toward the Yanghai tombs near Turpan in what's now Xinjiang, China. In 2008, archaeologists excavating a 700-year-old grave found something extraordinary. A leather basket filled with 789 grams of cannabis, carefully preserved by the desert's dry air. This wasn't hemp for rope. Lab analysis confirmed high levels of THC, and the plant material showed signs of cultivation. Someone had grown this cannabis deliberately, selected it for potency, and placed it in a shaman's tomb as a tool for the afterlife. You imagine the mourners arranging that basket, believing the deceased would need its smoke to navigate the realms beyond death. These early uses weren't recreational in the way you might understand the term today. Cannabis was serious business, woven into cosmology and medicine. The people who first burned it saw no separation between physical healing and spiritual communion. A fever might be caused by angry spirits, so the cure required both herbal medicine and ritual smoke to appease the unseen forces. Cannabis smoke, with its immediate and undeniable effects on consciousness, became proof that humans could touch the divine, could step briefly outside their ordinary minds and glimpse something larger. You feel a chill that has nothing to do with the mountain wind. There's something humbling about realizing that the desire to alter consciousness, to seek meaning beyond the everyday, runs so deep in human nature that it appears at the very dawn of complex society. While people were just learning to smelt bronze and domesticate horses, they were also experimenting with plants that could change how they perceived reality. And cannabis, tough and adaptable, spread wherever humans wandered. Its seeds travelled in saddlebags and trade caravans, taking root in new soils, adapting to new climates, waiting for each culture to discover its properties all over again. Archaeologists have found cannabis residue in sites scattered across Central Asia from this early period, and the pattern tells a story of deliberate cultivation and use. These weren't random wild plants. People were selecting, propagating, and transporting cannabis with purpose. Some scholars suggest that cannabis cultivation for psychoactive purposes may have developed independently in multiple regions, while others argue for a single origin point, with subsequent diffusion. The debate continues in academic journals, but either way, the conclusion is the same. Cannabis and humanity have been partners for at least 5,000 years, possibly longer. As you stand in that ancient landscape, you realize that the question, when did people start smoking weed, doesn't have a single, simple answer. It happened gradually, in multiple places, as curious humans encountered a remarkable plant and learned its secrets through generations of experimentation. The smoke that rises from modern joints and vaporizers carries an unbroken lineage back to these Bronze Age fires, back to shamans and healers who saw cannabis as a bridge between worlds. And the journey is just beginning, because once cannabis entered human culture, it never left. It traveled, evolved, and adapted, becoming a thread in the fabric of civilizations you haven't even visited yet. Let me continue to reach the target length. But there's another layer to this ancient relationship that you need to understand. Cannabis wasn't just about getting high, it was fundamentally practical. The same plant that produced mind-altering flowers also yielded the strongest natural fiber available to early peoples. You can picture ancient hands stripping the tall stalks, retting the fibers in water, and twisting them into rope that could hold a horse, nets that could catch fish, and fabric that could withstand years of wear. This duality meant cannabis had multiple reasons to be valued, transported, and cultivated. A community might grow it primarily for fiber, then gradually discover that the flowering tops, especially from female plants, produced interesting effects when burned or consumed. The archaeological evidence suggests that fiber use actually came first in many regions. Hemp seeds found at sites in China and Taiwan date back perhaps 8,000 years, long before anyone left clear evidence of psychoactive use. You watch in your mind's eye as early farmers gradually notice that some plants produce more resin, more flowers, more of that peculiar sticky coating that makes your fingers smell pungent and strange. Over centuries, perhaps millennia, people learned to recognize these traits and began selecting for them, creating the first primitive cultivars of what would eventually become distinct drug and fiber varieties. This dual nature would shape cannabis's entire history. It's why the plant spread so successfully. It offered something for everyone. Practical-minded communities grew it for rope and cloth. Spiritual seekers cultivated it for ritual and healing. Often these uses coexisted in the same culture, the same village, even the same family plot. You realize that the modern distinction between hemp and marijuana is artificial, a legal and cultural construct imposed on a plant that existed along a spectrum of traits for thousands of years before humans decided to classify it into separate categories. As you prepare to leave this ancient plateau, you glance back one more time at those ghostly fire pits. Somewhere in that smoke, in those first intentional inhalations, a relationship began that would shape medicine, religion, law, and culture across the entire span of human civilization. The story is far from simple, and it's definitely not boring, but it might just be the perfect subject to drift along with as sleep slowly finds you. You step forward in time now, landing in the 5th century BCE somewhere on the vast Eurasian steppe. The grass stretches endlessly in every direction, a sea of green and gold that ripples under wind strong enough to make you brace yourself. You're searching for the Scythians, nomadic horsemen whose culture left fewer permanent traces than settled civilizations, but whose cannabis practices were documented by someone unexpected. Herodotus, the Greek historian often called the father of history. He travelled widely, collected stories, and wrote them down with a mixture of careful observation and credulous wonder. When he described what the Scythians did after burying their dead, he gave the world its first detailed written account of people deliberately getting high on cannabis. You find a Scythian camp as autumn approaches, a temporary settlement of felt tents and livestock corrals. The people here are hardy and practical, their lives shaped by constant movement following herds and seasonal pastures. They're fierce warriors, expert archers who can shoot from horseback at full gallop, and they've built a culture that thrives in conditions that would break settled farmers. But today you're not watching them fight or hunt. You're observing a purification ritual that follows a funeral. Several men gather near a small structure that looks almost like a tiny tent, barely large enough for a person to crouch inside. They've set up a framework of wooden poles and draped it with thick woolen felt, creating a sealed chamber. In the center, they place a bronze vessel. Archaeologists will later call these objects censers, filled with glowing stones heated in the fire until they radiate waves of shimmering heat. You watch as one of the men produces a leather pouch and carefully sprinkles something onto the hot stones. The air inside the tent chamber immediately fills with thick, aromatic smoke. The men enter the enclosure one by one, pulling the felt flap closed behind them. You can't see what's happening inside, but Herodotus described it vividly enough that you can imagine. The men inhale deeply, the cannabis smoke filling their lungs, and soon they begin to howl with pleasure. The Greek historian wrote that they shout for joy at the vapor bath, a phrase that's delightfully unambiguous about the effects they're experiencing. This isn't solemn, silent meditation. It's ecstatic, physical, embodied intoxication. When the men finally emerge, their eyes are red and their movements languid. They're cleansed in their worldview, purified by the smoke and temporarily freed from the spiritual contamination that comes from handling the dead. You realize this practice serves multiple purposes simultaneously. It's hygiene ritual, social bonding, spiritual purification, and recreational pleasure all woven together in a way that doesn't distinguish between those categories. The Scythians wouldn't understand your question about whether this is medical or recreational use. It's simply what one does after a funeral, as natural and necessary as the funeral itself. Herodotus wasn't making this up, and we know that because archaeologists have found the physical evidence. In 1929, Russian archaeologist Sergei Rudenko excavated frozen tombs at Pazyryk in the Altai Mountains, Scythian burials preserved by permafrost for 2,400 years. Inside, he found exactly what Herodotus described: bronze censers, leather pouches, and wooden frameworks designed for creating smoke-filled enclosures. Later analysis identified cannabis residue on the bronze vessels and in the leather containers. The Greek historian, writing about barbarian customs that must have seemed bizarre to his Mediterranean audience, got it right. The Scythians really did hotbox cannabis smoke in tiny felt tents as part of their funeral customs. You crouch beside one of those ancient bronze censers now, imagining its journey. Someone crafted this vessel, casting molten bronze and hammering it into shape. It was used dozens, maybe hundreds of times, heating stones and vaporizing cannabis for generations of Scythian mourners. Then it was buried with a chieftain or noblewoman considered important enough to accompany them into the afterlife. And 2,400 years later, it emerged from frozen ground to confirm a story that scholars once dismissed as exaggeration. But here's where it gets interesting, and where historians still argue about the details. The Scythians were nomads whose territory stretched from modern Ukraine to Kazakhstan, a vast range that brought them into contact with dozens of other cultures. Did they invent this practice themselves? Or did they learn it from the settled peoples they traded with and occasionally raided? Cannabis was already being used in Central Asia when Scythian culture emerged, so they might have adopted an existing tradition and made it distinctly their own. Or perhaps they developed the felt tent hotbox technique independently, discovering that enclosing the smoke intensified its effects dramatically. What's undeniable is that the Scythians helped spread cannabis culture westward. They traded with Greeks, Persians, and other peoples around the Black Sea, and their customs, exotic, fascinating, sometimes shocking, became known throughout the ancient world. When Greeks like Herodotus wrote about cannabis use, they weren't describing a local practice. They were reporting on something foreign and strange, evidence that cannabis hadn't yet become common in Mediterranean culture. That would change eventually, but in the 5th century BCE, smoking cannabis was still something that those wild nomads in the north did. You watch smoke curl from the felt enclosure and think about transmission, how practices jump from culture to culture, carried by traders, soldiers, slaves, and travelers. The Scythians didn't have written records or permanent cities, but their funeral customs were so distinctive, so memorable, that they survived in Greek texts and archaeological sites. Every time someone in ancient Athens read Herodotus's account, they learned that far away on the steppe, people were deliberately inhaling cannabis smoke and shouting for joy. Some readers probably thought it was barbaric, others might have been curious. A few may have sought out cannabis to try it themselves. There's something poignant about the fact that we know the Scythian word for cannabis. It's cannabis, or rather, the Greek transcription of what the Scythians called it. The word itself travelled from language to language, eventually giving English and many other languages their term for the plant. You're watching cultural diffusion happen in real time, or at least in historical time, as a practice and a plant, and even a word spread from Central Asian steppes toward Europe, carried by nomads whose names we've mostly forgotten, but whose customs left an indelible mark. The felt tent finally falls silent. The men emerge fully now, blinking in the daylight, their ritual complete. They'll dismantle the enclosure, pack away the censer, and return to the ordinary work of nomadic life, tending animals, repairing equipment, preparing for winter or war. But for a few hours, they touched something beyond the everyday, and they did it with the help of a plant that was becoming humanity's companion across an ever-widening geography. You can almost hear Herodotus taking notes in the distance, his stylus scratching on papyrus, preserving this moment for readers who won't exist for thousands of years. And you realize that without him, without his curiosity about foreign customs, this particular chapter of cannabis history might have been lost entirely, just one more practice among countless others that vanished when nomadic cultures faded from the steppe. Let me add a bit more to reach the target. The sun angles lower now, painting the grasslands gold and purple. You linger a moment longer, watching the Scythian camp prepare for evening. Children chase each other between tents, horses whinny and stamp, and somewhere a woman sings in a language dead for 2 millennia. The cannabis plants that made this ritual possible are growing somewhere nearby, perhaps in a protected hollow, perhaps in several scattered plots tended by specialists who understand which plants produce the most resin, which seeds to save for next season. This knowledge is precious, passed down through apprenticeship and experience, never written because these people don't write. You feel the weight of what's been lost. All the details Herodotus didn't record, all the songs and stories and techniques that died when the last Scythian speakers. But you also feel gratitude for what survived, enough evidence to know that cannabis use was established, ritualized and valued among these steppe peoples, enough to understand that the practice was spreading, becoming part of the cultural exchange that connected ancient civilizations in ways that would shape the world you eventually inhabit. The smoke has cleared from the felt tent, but its echoes roll forward through time, reaching toward the next chapter in cannabis's long human story. You turn eastward now, following trade routes and migrating peoples until you arrive in ancient China, where cannabis finds a completely different cultural expression. The year is approximately 2737 BCE, according to legend, though the actual historical records are much later, and you're standing in what will become one of the world's most influential medical traditions. Here, cannabis isn't primarily about ecstatic rituals or funeral purification. It's medicine, catalogued and prescribed with the same systematic attention the Chinese bring to everything from astronomy to agriculture. You find yourself in the presence of Shen Nong, the mythical divine farmer, though whether he was a real emperor, a legendary figure, or a composite of many early herbalists is something historians still argue about. What matters is that a text bearing his name, the Shen Nong Ben Cao Jing, becomes one of the foundational documents of Chinese pharmacology, and it lists cannabis among its 365 medicinal plants. The Chinese call it Ma, a character that will evolve through thousands of years of linguistic change, but always refers to this particular plant and its many uses. You watch as an early physician examines a cannabis plant, not with mystical reverence but with practical attention. He's interested in which parts treat which ailments, how to prepare them, what dosages work, and what side effects might occur. The roots, he notes, can be boiled and applied to reduce inflammation and stop bleeding. The seeds, what later generations will call hemp seeds, can be ground into a nutritious paste or pressed for oil that serves both culinary and medicinal purposes. They help with constipation, restore energy, and nourish patients recovering from illness. But it's the flowers and leaves, particularly from female plants, that contain the stronger medicine. You observe as the physician carefully harvests the resinous tops, explaining to an apprentice that these preparations can ease pain, calm spasms, and treat conditions ranging from rheumatism to malaria. In some texts, cannabis is recommended for childbirth pain, for menstrual difficulties, for nervous disorders that leave patients anxious and sleepless. The Chinese medical tradition doesn't shy away from the psychoactive effects. It simply contextualizes them as part of the plant's therapeutic profile, sometimes desirable and sometimes to be minimized depending on the patient and the condition. What strikes you most is the systematic nature of this knowledge. The Chinese aren't just using cannabis, they're documenting it, teaching it, building an institutional medical system that will preserve and transmit this information across centuries. By the time of the Han Dynasty, around 200 CE, the physician Hua Tuo is reportedly using cannabis as an anesthetic, mixing it with wine to create a preparation called Ma Fei San that allows him to perform surgical procedures while patients remain unconscious or at least deeply sedated. Imagine that. Surgery with cannabis anesthesia nearly 2,000 years ago, a technique that will be forgotten and rediscovered multiple times as medical knowledge rises and falls with the fortunes of civilizations. You flip through the pages of ancient texts, or rather, you imagine them, since most of these early documents survive only as later copies or references in other works. The Mingyi Bi Lu, compiled around 500 CE, expands on earlier knowledge and classifies cannabis effects with precision. Too much, the text warns, will cause people to see demons and walk aimlessly. The right amount, properly prepared, brings healing. This isn't moral judgment, it's dose-response relationship, pharmacology before the word existed. The Chinese approach differs fundamentally from what you witnessed on the Scythian steppe. There's less emphasis on smoke inhalation, more on oral preparations, tinctures, teas, foods infused with ground cannabis seeds or flowers. The goal isn't ecstatic communion with spirits, but restoration of balance, the return of a sick body to health. Yet both cultures recognize the same fundamental truth. Cannabis is powerful. It changes how bodies and minds function, and harnessing that power requires knowledge, respect, and careful attention. You stand in an ancient pharmacy now, shelves lined with ceramic jars and wooden drawers, each labeled with characters naming the plant or mineral inside. The cannabis drawer is neither hidden nor prominently displayed. It's simply one medicine among many, available when needed, prescribed according to the patient's constitution and the nature of their illness. A young apprentice measures out a dose, grinding the material in a stone mortar, following instructions that have been passed down through generations of physicians. Here's something that might surprise you. Archaeological evidence suggests that cannabis cultivation in China focused heavily on fiber production for most of the population, but that specialized medical cannabis with higher psychoactive content was also grown and recognized as distinct. Ancient farmers were already beginning to understand what modern science would later confirm, that cannabis plants vary enormously in their chemical composition, and that selective breeding can emphasize different traits. The cannabis grown for rope and cloth wasn't the same as the cannabis harvested for Hua Tuo's surgical anesthesia, even though they were botanically the same species. The Chinese medical texts also reveal something else. Cannabis was considered a serious medicine, sometimes classified among the inferior or assistant drugs, not because it was weak, but because it was strong enough to require caution. Superior drugs in Chinese medical theory were gentle tonics you could take daily to maintain health. Inferior drugs were powerful interventions used only when necessary, capable of both great healing and potential harm. Cannabis fell into this category, respected but not casual, powerful but requiring skill to use properly. You watch as a patient arrives complaining of joint pain that's plagued him for years. The physician questions him carefully about the quality of the pain. When it worsens, what provides relief? He checks the pulse at several points, examines the tongue, and considers the patient's overall constitution. Finally, he prescribes a formula containing several herbs, including cannabis, to be taken as a tea twice daily for a month. The patient leaves with his packet of medicine, trusting in a system that's been refined over centuries. But not all cannabis use in ancient China was purely medical in this formal sense. You catch glimpses of other contexts, religious Taoists using it in incense mixtures that produce visions and facilitate spiritual journeys, ordinary people occasionally eating cannabis-infused foods during festivals or celebrations. The boundaries between medicine, religion, and recreation blur in ways that would frustrate modern regulators trying to classify the plant into neat legal categories. An incense that helps a monk achieve meditative states, is that medicine or religion? A food served at a wedding feast that makes guests cheerful and relaxed, is that recreation or social ritual? Historians still argue about how widespread recreational cannabis use was in ancient China compared to medicinal and fiber use. The written records emphasize medical applications because that's what physicians wrote about, but absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Ordinary people rarely appear in historical texts, so we can only speculate about whether farmers occasionally sampled the flowers from their hemp fields, whether neighbors shared cannabis-infused wine at gatherings, whether young people experimented the way young people always have. What's undeniable is that by the first few centuries CE, China had developed sophisticated knowledge about cannabis that encompassed cultivation techniques, medical applications, dosing strategies, and awareness of both benefits and risks. This knowledge would spread throughout East Asia as Chinese medical texts were translated, and Chinese physicians traveled to Korea, Japan, and beyond. You're watching the creation of a medical paradigm that will influence millions of people across thousands of years. A paradigm that sees cannabis as medicine first, neither demonized nor glorified, simply understood as one tool among many in the healer's kit. The sun sets over the ancient pharmacy, and you notice the apprentice carefully cleaning his mortar, returning the cannabis to its designated drawer, making notes about the prescription in the patient register. Everything is orderly, systematic, part of an ongoing tradition that values accumulated knowledge and careful observation. In this moment, cannabis is neither sacred nor taboo. It's simply useful. And that might be the most revolutionary perspective of all. You journey westward and southward now, crossing the Himalayas into the Indian subcontinent, where cannabis takes on yet another identity, one deeply woven into religious practice, mythology, and daily spiritual life. The air here is different, thick with humidity and the scent of marigolds and incense. You've arrived in a land where cannabis isn't just medicine or ritual tool, but a gift from the gods themselves, specifically from Shiva, the destroyer and transformer, the ascetic lord who sits in eternal meditation on Mount Kailash. The earliest references appear in the Vedas, ancient Sanskrit texts composed between 1500 and 1000 BCE, though their exact dating remains debated among scholars. In the Atharva Veda, cannabis, called Bhang, is listed as one of 5 sacred plants, a source of happiness and liberation that releases humans from anxiety. You read the verses translated across millennia and feel their reverence. We tell of the 5 kingdoms of herbs headed by Soma, Mayit and Kusa grass, and Bhang and barley, and the herb Saha release us from anxiety. This isn't casual mention. Cannabis is positioned alongside Soma, the mysterious and sacred plant whose identity scholars still argue about, never quite agreeing whether it was ephedra, mushrooms, or something else entirely lost to time. You find yourself at a festival, perhaps Holi or Mahashivaratri, where devotees celebrate with Bhang Lassi, a drink made from ground cannabis leaves mixed with milk, almonds, spices, and sugar. The preparation is almost ceremonial. Cannabis leaves are soaked and ground with water, then strained and mixed with the other ingredients until the result is a pale green beverage that tastes earthy and slightly bitter despite the sweetening. People of all ages participate, though the strongest preparations are reserved for adults and serious practitioners. You watch as a sadhu, a wandering holy man with matted hair and ash-smeared skin, accepts a clay cup of bhang and drinks it down with a muttered prayer to Shiva. The connection between cannabis and Shiva runs deep in Hindu tradition, told through stories that vary by region but share common themes. One popular legend claims that Shiva, after a family argument, stormed away into the fields and fell asleep under a leafy plant. When he woke, he ate some of the leaves and felt so refreshed, so renewed, that cannabis became his favorite food. Another story tells that when the gods churned the cosmic ocean to obtain Amrita, the nectar of immortality, cannabis emerged from the drops that fell to earth, making it a divine substance, literally born from the same cosmic event that produced immortality itself. These aren't just quaint myths. They reflect a theological understanding of cannabis as a substance that helps bridge the gap between human and divine consciousness. Shiva is the great yogi, the ultimate ascetic, who transcends ordinary reality through meditation and austerity. His association with cannabis suggests that the plant can serve a similar function, helping practitioners achieve states of consciousness that approach the divine. When a sadhu smokes a chillum filled with cannabis and tobacco, offering the first puff to Shiva with the cry, "Boom Shankar," he's not just getting high, he's performing a religious act, using a sacred plant to honor, and emulate the god. You follow a group of sadhus to the banks of the Ganges, where they've established a temporary camp during a religious festival. Their chillums, straight conical pipes traditionally made of clay, are passed from hand to hand in a ritualized pattern. Each man receives the pipe with both hands, takes his drawers, and passes it on, the cannabis mixed with tobacco burning steadily. The conversation flows between philosophy and gossip, between stories of their wandering lives and debates about spiritual texts. The cannabis doesn't make them incoherent or sluggish. It seems to facilitate their discussion, loosening thoughts, making connections more fluid. But cannabis in India isn't limited to religious devotees and festivals. You discover that it's also woven into traditional medicine, particularly Ayurveda, the ancient healing system that parallels Chinese medicine in its age and sophistication. Ayurvedic texts describe cannabis as having the ability to increase mental clarity, stimulate appetite, and treat a range of ailments from insomnia to epilepsy. Different preparations serve different purposes. Bhang for mild, controlled effects, ganja, the dried flowers, for stronger medicine, and charas, hand-rolled hashish, for the most potent applications. The social acceptance of cannabis in traditional Indian culture is remarkable from your modern perspective. While alcohol might be viewed with suspicion or outright prohibition in many communities, cannabis, particularly in the form of bhang, is tolerated and even celebrated. Village elders might share bhang during festivals. Soldiers might consume it before battle for courage and pain relief. Labourers might drink bhang lassi to endure long days of physical work in brutal heat. The plant is simply part of the cultural fabric, neither particularly controversial nor seen as a dangerous vice. You sit in a village square as an older man prepares bhang for a small gathering. His movements are practiced, efficient. He's done this thousands of times. He explains that cannabis must be treated with respect, not abused. Too much, especially for someone unaccustomed, can bring unpleasant experiences, paranoia, and nausea. The right amount, in the right context, with the right intention, brings community, insight, and connection. It's dose and intention that matter, he says, not the plant itself. The plant is neutral, a tool, and tools can be used skillfully or clumsily. Historians still argue about whether ancient Indian cannabis use was primarily recreational or religious, and whether that distinction even makes sense in a culture where the sacred and the everyday are so thoroughly intertwined. When a farmer takes bhang before a village festival, is he worshipping Shiva or just enjoying himself? The answer might be both simultaneously without contradiction. The Western tendency to separate religious from recreational use may not map well onto cultures where religion isn't a separate sphere of life, but rather the context in which all life unfolds. What's clear is that by the time Sanskrit texts were being composed, cannabis was already deeply established in Indian culture, with enough history behind it to have generated mythology, medical knowledge, and social customs. This suggests that the plant had been present in India for centuries or millennia before the written record, carried there by migrations, trade, or independent discovery. The Indian subcontinent has wild cannabis growing in many regions, so local populations had ample opportunity to encounter the plant and explore its properties. You watch smoke from the chillum curl upward into the evening sky, mixing with smoke from cooking fires and the incense burning at a small shrine to Ganesha. The sounds of the village surround you, children playing, a woman singing, the distant bells of a temple. Cannabis is simply here, part of this world, neither hidden nor flaunted, as ordinary and extraordinary as the gods themselves. And you realize that this comfortable integration, this lack of fear or obsessive regulation, represents something that much of the world will lose and struggle to regain. A simple acceptance of a plant as gift, medicine, and companion. A sadhu approaches the fire and tells a story about Shiva drinking poison to save the world, the poison turning his throat blue, and cannabis being offered to soothe the burning. Whether the story is ancient or recent invention doesn't really matter. It's true in the way myths are true, expressing a cultural understanding that cannabis is protective, healing, and divine. You listen until the story ends, until the last of the bhang is consumed, until the fires burn low and stars emerge overhead in patterns that haven't changed since the Vedas were first composed. And somewhere in the distance, you imagine Shiva himself, sitting in meditation with a chillum beside him, smiling at the humans below who've learned to use his favorite plant. You drift westward now, carried on trade winds and caravan routes, until you arrive in the medieval Islamic world, a vast territory stretching from Spain to Persia, from North Africa to Central Asia. Here, cannabis transforms again, taking the concentrated form called hashish, which becomes intertwined with poetry, mysticism, medicine, and quiet rebellion against authority. The year might be 1000 CE, or 1200, or 1400. This culture persists across centuries, adapting and evolving, but maintaining certain core relationships with the resinous extract that Arabs call hashish, literally dry herb or grass. You find yourself in a bustling marketplace in Baghdad, Cairo, or perhaps Damascus. The air smells of cardamom, leather, and human sweat. Merchants call out their wares while veiled women examine fabrics and bearded men negotiate over spices. In a quiet corner, in establishments that exist in a legal grey zone, hashish changes hands. Unlike the raw cannabis flower, hashish is concentrated, the resinous trichomes scraped or sieved from plants and compressed into dark, fragrant cakes or balls. A small amount produces powerful effects, making it portable, concealable, and valuable. The relationship between Islam and hashish is complicated, layered with contradictions that historians still untangle. The Quran explicitly forbids alcohol, khamar, intoxicants that cloud judgment. But cannabis isn't mentioned by name. This omission created centuries of debate among Islamic scholars and jurists. Some argued that any intoxicant falls under the prohibition against khamar. Others maintained that since cannabis wasn't specifically named, and since it produces different effects than alcohol, it occupies a different legal and moral category. The debate never fully resolved, leaving hashish in perpetual legal ambiguity, sometimes tolerated, sometimes persecuted, depending on the ruler, the region, and the political winds. You enter a hashish den, a small room with cushions arranged around the walls and a hookah bubbling in the center. Men recline here, some locals and some travelers sharing the pipe and conversation. The atmosphere is contemplative, occasionally punctuated by laughter, but mostly subdued. This isn't the rowdy chaos of a tavern. Hashish produces a different kind of sociability, more introspective, more inclined toward philosophical meandering than aggressive boisterousness. The proprietor, who might be raided and punished tomorrow, or left alone for years, serves tea and keeps the hashish flowing, providing a space where men can temporarily step outside the demands of religious observance and social propriety. But hashish isn't just about secret dens and law-breaking. You discover it woven throughout Islamic culture in unexpected places. Sufi mystics, seeking direct experience of the divine through ecstatic practices, sometimes use hashish to facilitate their spiritual journeys. The whirling dervishes, the poets who compose verses praising mystical union with God, the ascetics who retreat from the world to focus on prayer, some of them find that hashish helps quiet the ordinary mind and open channels to transcendent experience. Is this heresy or devotion? The answer depends on who you ask, and the ambiguity persists across centuries. Medieval Islamic poetry is shot through with references to hashish, often veiled in metaphor but sometimes startlingly direct. You read verses by Ibn al-Baitar, the Andalusian botanist and pharmacist, who catalogues cannabis in his medical encyclopedia with scientific precision, while poets praise its effects in language that borders on worship. The poetry sometimes personifies hashish as a beautiful woman, sometimes as a wise teacher. sometimes simply as escape from the grinding hardships of medieval urban life. One poet writes of hashish sellers being punished while wine sellers go free, noting the irony with bitter humor. Another describes the green journey that hashish provides, carrying the user to gardens more beautiful than any earthly paradise. The medical establishment of the Islamic Golden Age takes cannabis seriously, building on earlier Greek, Persian, and Indian texts, while adding their own observations. You flip through Arabic medical manuscripts, or rather their echoes in later European translations, and find cannabis prescribed for pain, inflammation, eye diseases, and mental disturbances. Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, includes cannabis in his Canon of Medicine, the text that will dominate European medical education for centuries. He notes both therapeutic uses and potential dangers, warning that excessive use can cause dry brain and disturb the senses. What strikes you is how hashish becomes a marker of cultural resistance and social criticism. When authorities crack down on hashish dens, they're often targeting spaces where people gather outside official control, where conversations might turn political, where the rigid hierarchies of Islamic society temporarily dissolve. Hashish users in medieval Islam sometimes form their own subcultures, with distinct slang, customs, and mutual recognition. They're not revolutionaries exactly, but they occupy spaces of autonomy that make power nervous. You witness a raid, soldiers bursting into a hashish den, overturning cushions, smashing the hookah, dragging protesting men into the street. The punishment might be flogging, imprisonment, or public humiliation. The proprietor might be executed as an example. Yet within weeks or months the den reopens elsewhere, or another takes its place because the demand persists and the prohibition is incomplete. This pattern, crackdown and resurgence, persecution and persistence, becomes familiar across Islamic history, a cycle that never fully resolves. Trade routes carry hashish far and wide. You follow it along the Silk Road into Central Asia, across the Mediterranean to North Africa and Spain, into the hands of merchants who sell it alongside spices and textiles. The Mongol invasions, devastating as they are, also facilitate exchange, including cannabis culture, between East and West. By the late medieval period, hashish use is established from Persia to Morocco, each region developing its own preparation methods, consumption rituals, and social meanings. But there's a darker thread in the hashish story, one that will echo into modern times with tragic consequences. You hear whispers about the assassins, the Nizari Ismaili sect supposedly controlled by the old man of the mountain, who drugs his followers with hashish and shows them paradise, then sends them out to murder political targets with the promise of returning to that paradise after death. The story, popularized by Marco Polo and other medieval writers, links hashish with violence, fanaticism, and mind control. Historians still argue about how much of the assassin legend is true, and how much is propaganda invented by enemies of the Nizari Ismailis. The word assassin itself supposedly derives from hashishin, hashish users, but this etymology is disputed. What matters is that the story spreads, becomes common knowledge, and creates an association between cannabis and dangerous, irrational violence that will be weaponized centuries later in Western anti-cannabis campaigns. You can see the seeds of future moral panic being planted in medieval storytelling, taking root in cultural memory where facts and myths become hopelessly tangled. As you sit in a rebuilt hashish den after the soldiers have gone, you notice something essential. The people here aren't monsters or fanatics. They're poets and labourers, merchants and students, ordinary people seeking pleasure, relief, community, or transcendence. The hashish makes some talkative and others silent. Some laugh at private jokes while others stare into the middle distance, following thoughts too complex or fragmented to share. It's profoundly human, this gathering, neither particularly noble nor particularly degraded, just people using a plant to alter their consciousness for a few hours before returning to the demands of survival in a difficult world. The proprietor tells you that hashish has always existed in this in-between space, not quite legal but not always illegal, sometimes tolerated and sometimes persecuted, used by mystics and criminals, poets and laborers, praised and condemned often by the same people, depending on context. This ambiguity, he suggests, is hashish's natural habitat. It resists simple categorization, which is perhaps why authorities have always struggled to control it. You can ban it, punish it, preach against it, but it persists in the margins, in the spaces between official categories, carried by people who find in it something they need badly enough to risk punishment. Night deepens over the medieval city. Somewhere a muezzin calls the faithful to prayer, while in this dim room men pass the hookah and speak in low voices about philosophy, politics, and dreams. The contradiction doesn't trouble anyone here. They contain multitudes, as all humans do, faithful and transgressive, pious and pleasure-seeking, never fully one thing or another. And hashish, that ancient concentrate of cannabis resin, continues its long journey through human culture, accumulating meanings like layers of sediment, becoming more complex and contradictory with each passing century. You turn southward now, crossing the Sahara's vast emptiness until you reach sub-Saharan Africa, where cannabis has yet another story to tell, one less documented in written texts, but no less rich in cultural significance. The evidence here comes from archaeology, anthropology, oral traditions, and the observations of early travelers who wrote down what they saw, though often through lenses of misunderstanding and prejudice. You're tracing cannabis across a continent where it may have arrived from multiple directions, carried south by Arab traders, brought by Indian Ocean maritime routes to the eastern coast, possibly even present much earlier through pathways history hasn't fully mapped. You find yourself in a village somewhere in Central or Southern Africa, perhaps in the region that will become modern-day Congo, Zimbabwe, or South Africa. The exact location and time period blur because cannabis integrated into so many African societies across such a vast geography that pinning down a single origin point becomes nearly impossible. What matters is that by the time European colonizers arrive and start writing their accounts, cannabis, called daga in some regions, diamba in others, with dozens of local names reflecting dozens of distinct relationships, is already deeply established. Archaeological evidence offers tantalizing clues. In Ethiopia, researchers have found pipes in caves dated to around 1320 CE, with residue suggesting cannabis use. In South Africa, excavations at sites like Lalibela Cave have uncovered ceramic smoking pipes dating back centuries, long before European contact. These aren't crude experiments. They're refined technologies, purpose-built tools that suggest long familiarity with cannabis smoking. The pipes are often beautifully crafted, some with multiple chambers for cooling smoke, others decorated with carved patterns that speak of cultural significance beyond mere utility. You sit with a group of men around a communal pipe, watching the ritual unfold. The pipe itself is impressive, a long tube connecting a water reservoir to a clay bowl where cannabis smoulders. The smoker creates suction, drawing smoke through water that cools and filters it before inhalation. This technology, independently developed or adapted from elsewhere, demonstrates sophisticated understanding of how to make cannabis smoking more pleasant and less harsh on the lungs. The pipe passes from hand to hand according to social hierarchies you're only beginning to understand. Age, status, kinship ties, all determine who smokes when. Cannabis in traditional African societies serves multiple purposes, woven into the fabric of daily life in ways that resist simple categorization. You observe it used before hunting expeditions, the hunters believing it sharpens senses and stamina. You see it employed in healing rituals, where the smoke is blown over a sick person, or the plant is prepared as medicine for various ailments. You witness it in social gatherings where elders discuss community affairs, the cannabis facilitating conversation and consensus building. And you notice it in spiritual contexts, where shamans and diviners use cannabis to enter altered states that allow communication with ancestors or spirits. What's striking is the normalization. Cannabis isn't hidden or shameful in many of these societies. It's simply there, part of adult life, regulated by custom and tradition rather than law. Young people are generally excluded or limited in their access, not through legal prohibition, but through social structures that reserve cannabis for initiated adults, usually men, who have earned the right through age and status. The system isn't perfect and certainly isn't gender equal by modern standards, but it represents a form of community-based regulation that functions without police or prisons. You learn that some groups cultivate cannabis as a trade crop, growing it deliberately for exchange with neighboring peoples or distant traders. The plant adapts well to African climates, and certain regions become known for producing particularly potent varieties. This economic dimension adds another layer. Cannabis becomes valuable, something to be protected and controlled, a source of wealth and prestige for those who grow the best plants. Trade networks develop, carrying cannabis across vast distances, connecting communities that might otherwise have little contact. But there's darkness in this story too, shadows that will lengthen into tragedy. When European colonizers arrive, they observe cannabis use and interpret it through their own prejudices and anxieties. To colonial administrators, African cannabis use becomes another mark of primitive culture, another justification for paternalistic control. Some colonizers worry that cannabis makes African laborers less productive or more difficult to control. Others simply add cannabis prohibition to the long list of ways they attempt to reshape African societies according to European norms. You witness the beginning of this transformation, colonial laws being written, traditional practices criminalized, people punished for behaviors their ancestors engaged in for generations. The reasons given are protection and civilization, but the effects are cultural destruction and new forms of control. Cannabis prohibition in Africa, as in so many places, becomes a tool of power, a way to criminalize populations and justify intervention into their lives. Yet resistance persists. You follow cannabis into the margins where it continues despite prohibition, carried forward by people who refuse to abandon their traditions simply because foreigners declare them illegal. In some regions, entire communities quietly maintain cannabis cultivation and use, developing elaborate systems to hide their practices from colonial authorities. Knowledge that was once transmitted openly now passes in whispers, seeds hidden and plants grown in secret locations. The cultural practices adapted to survive in hostile legal environments. Historians still argue about when cannabis first arrived in Africa and through which routes. Some evidence suggests it was present in northern and eastern Africa by 1000 CE or earlier, carried by Arab traders and Indian Ocean maritime commerce. Other scholars point to possible earlier presence, though the evidence grows thinner the further back you search. What's undeniable is that by the time of sustained European contact in the 1500s and 1600s, cannabis was already established across much of sub-Saharan Africa, suggesting centuries, if not millennia, of prior history. You sit with an elderly cultivator who explains which plants produce the strongest effects, how to recognize female plants by their flowers, when to harvest for optimal potency. His knowledge is encyclopedic, accumulated across a lifetime and passed down from his grandfather and great-grandfather before him. This is scientific observation conducted without laboratories or written records, but it's no less sophisticated for that. He knows things about cannabis that pharmaceutical researchers won't rediscover until the 21st century. How environmental stress affects potency, how different harvesting times produce different effects, how proper curing and storage preserve quality. The tragedy is that so much of this knowledge will be lost or fragmented by colonization, criminalization, and cultural disruption. The elder's grandchildren might not learn what he knows because cannabis cultivation has become too dangerous, because they've moved to cities, because the continuity of tradition has been severed. Across Africa, cannabis knowledge that took centuries to develop will be scattered and suppressed, surviving only in fragments, in hidden practices, in the memories of people who can't safely share what they know. But in this moment, before the worst of the disruption, you see cannabis integrated into African life with a complexity and sophistication that challenges any simple narrative. It's not just that people in Africa use cannabis. They develop their own unique relationships with it, their own cultivation techniques, consumption methods, and cultural meanings. The pipes are different from those in the Middle East or Asia. The social rituals are distinct. The spiritual understandings reflect African cosmologies, not imported frameworks. This is indigenous innovation, local knowledge, cultural creativity working with a plant that traveled from distant origins to find new homes and new meanings. As you prepare to leave this African village, you notice children playing in the distance, their laughter carrying on the breeze. They're unaware that their world stands on the edge of transformation, that soon people will arrive who will try to remake everything according to foreign patterns. The cannabis plants growing in protected plots nearby will become contraband. The pipes will need to be hidden. The knowledge will go underground, but it won't disappear entirely. It will persist in the shadows, adapted and resilient, waiting for a future moment when it might be safe to emerge again. You carry with you a profound respect for the diversity of human relationships with cannabis, how this single plant has been woven into so many cultures in so many distinct ways. Africa's cannabis story is not the same as India's or China's or the Islamic world's. It's uniquely African, shaped by local environments, cultures, and histories. And like all the other stories you've traced, it's far more complex and nuanced than any simple narrative of people got high could ever capture. You step forward in time now, arriving in Renaissance Europe where cannabis exists primarily as hemp, the fiber crop that makes sails, rope and clothing, but rarely appears in contexts that suggest widespread knowledge of its psychoactive properties. The year might be 1500 or 1600, and you're standing in a port city, perhaps Venice, Lisbon or Amsterdam, watching ships being fitted with hemp rigging and hemp sails. The sailors and merchants here have no idea that in distant lands, people use this same plant to alter consciousness. To them, cannabis is simply hemp, an indispensable industrial material, perhaps the most important fiber in their world. You walk through fields where hemp grows tall and dense, cultivated for its strong stalks. European farmers have been growing hemp for centuries by this point, possibly since Roman times or earlier, but they select for varieties that maximize fiber production. Tall plants with minimal branching and relatively low levels of psychoactive compounds. These fields wouldn't interest a recreational user or someone seeking medicine. The plants here are optimized for a completely different purpose, shaped by generations of agricultural selection toward fiber and away from flowers. The confusion starts when European explorers, traders and colonizers begin encountering cannabis in Asia, Africa, and eventually the Americas. They see plants that look similar to their familiar hemp, but are used in completely different ways. You follow a Portuguese merchant on his return from India, where he witnessed people consuming bhang during festivals. He writes a letter home describing the strange custom, noting that the hemp the Indians use seems similar to European hemp, but produces powerful, intoxicating effects when eaten or smoked. His European readers are puzzled. How can the same plant that makes their rope also make people see visions? The answer, though no one fully understands it yet, lies in the plant's remarkable variability and the different directions various cultures have taken in cultivating it. Europeans breeding for fiber inadvertently bred out psychoactivity. Indians, Arabs, Chinese, and others breeding for medicine or intoxication encouraged it. Same species, different cultivars, producing such different results that people reasonably wonder if they're actually looking at the same plant. The botanical confusion will persist for centuries, with cannabis going by dozens of different names. Hemp, Indian hemp, hashish plant, marijuana, and Europeans struggling to understand the relationships between them. You observe a European physician named Garcia da Horta, working in Portuguese Goa in the 1560s, documenting Indian medical practices, including cannabis use. He's one of the first Europeans to seriously investigate cannabis as medicine rather than merely as fiber. In his book Coloquios dos Simples, he describes bhang and its effects with scientific curiosity tempered by moral judgment. The Indians use it to stimulate appetite, relieve pain, and produce cheerfulness, he notes, but also warns of potential dangers and questions the wisdom of such practices. His work begins to introduce European medicine to the possibility that cannabis might have therapeutic applications beyond rope making, but this knowledge penetrates European culture slowly, incompletely. Most Europeans remain entirely ignorant of cannabis psychoactivity throughout the Renaissance and into the Enlightenment. Hemp cultivation expands as maritime trade increases. More ships need more sails and rope, and hemp is simply the best material available. The English Navy depends on hemp. So does every other European naval power. Colonial administrators in America mandate hemp cultivation in some colonies, considering it strategically important for maritime supremacy. You stand in the American colonies now, perhaps Virginia in the 1600s, watching colonists plant hemp as required by law. They're following orders from across the Atlantic, growing a crop that their government deems essential for national security. George Washington will grow hemp at Mount Vernon. Thomas Jefferson will cultivate it at Monticello. But there's no evidence these founding fathers knew about or cared about cannabis's psychoactive properties. They were growing it for fiber, period. The folk myth that they were secretly getting high on their hemp fields is almost certainly false, a modern projection backward onto people who simply needed rope and cloth. Yet knowledge does occasionally surface. You find a 1621 book by Robert Burton called The Anatomy of Melancholy, which mentions cannabis among other remedies for depression and various mental afflictions. Burton's reference is brief, and he seems uncertain about the details, but it demonstrates that some awareness of cannabis as medicine had reached England by the early 17th century. Other medical texts occasionally mention it, usually copying information from earlier Arabic or Indian sources without much first-hand European experience. The problem is that the cannabis growing in European fields, bred for centuries as fiber, probably wouldn't produce noticeable psychoactive effects even if someone tried to smoke or eat it, and most Europeans had no reason to try. They had alcohol for intoxication, opium for pain relief, and various herbs for other medical purposes. Cannabis occupied a comfortable niche as industrial fiber, and stepping outside that niche required both knowledge of different cultivars and motivation to seek them out. Most people had neither. You watch as European scientists begin classifying plants more systematically. In 1753, Carl Linnaeus publishes his Species Plantarum, attempting to create a comprehensive taxonomy of all known plants. He includes Cannabis sativa as a species, the name that will stick for centuries. Later, in 1785, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck proposes a second species, Cannabis indica, based on plants from India that seem morphologically and chemically distinct from European hemp. Historians still argue about whether these are truly separate species or merely varieties of a single highly variable species. But the names reflect the growing European awareness that cannabis isn't just one thing. There are different types with different properties. What strikes you is the disconnect. the way Europeans can be so intimate with cannabis as fiber, while remaining almost completely ignorant of its other uses. Sailors handle hemp rope daily, their lives literally depending on its strength, yet they don't know that in India, wandering holy men smoke this same plant to commune with Shiva. Farmers cultivate vast fields of hemp without realizing that in Africa, their crop is also a traditional medicine and social lubricant. The plant exists in two separate worlds, industrial Europe and psychoactive everywhere else, and the two worlds barely communicate. This ignorance won't last forever. By the 19th century, European colonization, trade, and scientific exploration will bring fuller knowledge of cannabis's diversity. But for now, in the Renaissance and early modern period, most Europeans remain in the dark. They know half the plant's story, perhaps not even half, and that partial knowledge will shape how they respond when fuller understanding finally arrives. You can already sense the pattern forming, Europeans encountering practices they don't understand, interpreting them through frameworks of civilization and savagery, superiority and backwardness. Cannabis will eventually become one more thing colonized peoples do that Europeans view with suspicion or contempt. But there are exceptions, moments of curiosity and openness. A few European travelers write admiringly of cannabis use they witness abroad. A handful of physicians experiment with imported preparations, trying to unlock therapeutic potential. These are minority voices, easily drowned out by the dominant narrative of hemp as industrial crop and nothing more. But they represent a path not taken, a world where Europeans might have approached cannabis with scientific interest rather than moral panic, where they might have learned from other cultures instead of condemning them. As the Renaissance fades into the Enlightenment, you watch ships leaving European ports, their hemp sails billowing in the wind, carrying colonizers, traders, missionaries, and scientists to every corner of the globe. They're sailing on cannabis, quite literally, propelled by wind caught in hemp cloth and secured by hemp rope. But they're sailing toward encounters with cannabis cultures they barely comprehend, carrying prejudices and assumptions that will shape centuries of misunderstanding. The collision, when it fully comes, will be neither pretty nor simple, and you brace yourself for what's ahead as you prepare to follow cannabis into the modern world. You cross the Atlantic now, following those hemp-sailed ships to the Americas, where cannabis arrives with European colonizers as an agricultural necessity, but also travels through other pathways you're only beginning to trace. The story splits into multiple threads: official hemp cultivation mandated by colonial governments, African slaves bringing their own cannabis traditions, and later Mexican and Caribbean immigration introducing yet another set of relationships with the plant. You're watching convergence, the moment when different cannabis cultures begin to mix in a new world context that will eventually reshape global attitudes toward the plant. The official story is straightforward enough. English colonies in North America need hemp for naval stores, rope, canvas, oakum for caulking ships, and the colonial administrators in London aren't interested in depending on foreign suppliers for such strategic materials, so they mandate cultivation. Virginia passes a law in 1619 requiring every planter to grow hemp. Other colonies follow with similar requirements or incentives. The seeds planted are European fiber varieties, selected over generations for tall stalks and strong fiber, producing plants with minimal psychoactive properties. You walk through a colonial hemp field in the early 1700s, watching enslaved workers and indentured servants labor under brutal conditions. The work is backbreaking, planting, weeding, harvesting, retting the stalks in water to separate fibers, then processing those fibers into usable material. Nobody here is getting high off these plants. The thought probably doesn't occur to anyone except possibly some of the African slaves who might recognize the plant from their homelands and wonder why these particular varieties produce such different effects. Because here's where the story gets complicated. where multiple cannabis traditions collide. Some enslaved Africans brought to the Americas came from regions where cannabis use was traditional and culturally significant. They arrive in a new world that grows cannabis but doesn't smoke it, that treats as industrial fiber what they knew as medicine and social ritual. You can only imagine the cognitive dissonance, seeing a familiar plant put to entirely different uses, being forced to cultivate it for masters' purposes, while their own cultural relationships with it are suppressed or forgotten. There's limited historical evidence for cannabis use among enslaved populations in colonial America, which makes sense given that enslaved people rarely appear in historical records, except when whites choose to write about them. But fragments exist. Occasional mentions in travelers' accounts, folklore, and oral traditions collected much later. Circumstantial evidence from the presence of cannabis seeds at archaeological sites. The full story is probably lost, scattered among the countless erasures of slavery and colonization, but you sense its outline. Some enslaved Africans maintained cannabis knowledge and use despite the hostile environment, adapting their practices to survive in contexts of surveillance and control. By the 1800s, hemp cultivation in the United States is well established, but beginning to face competition from imported fibers and eventually from synthetic materials. The great hemp fields of Kentucky produced tons of fiber for rope and cloth, supporting a significant industry. But this is still fiber hemp, agricultural cannabis bred away from psychoactivity. The farmers and factory workers processing it into rope have no more awareness of its potential as an intoxicant than their European counterparts. Then new threads appear. You notice Mexican workers arriving in the southwestern United States in the early 1900s, particularly after the Mexican Revolution of 1910, sends waves of refugees and migrants northward. Some bring cannabis with them, but not the hemp grown in Kentucky fields. They bring marijuana, their term for the flowering tops of psychoactive cannabis varieties, traditionally used in Mexico for medicine and recreation. This cannabis is different, cultivated for different purposes, and the word itself is different, possibly derived from Mexican Spanish or indigenous language roots. You follow these migrants into Texas, California, New Mexico, watching as they establish communities and maintain cultural practices including cannabis use. To them, marijuana is ordinary, perhaps a medicine for aches and pains, perhaps something to ease the stress of hard labor in a foreign land that doesn't particularly welcome them. But to Anglo-Americans observing this practice, it's alien and suspicious, another mark of difference that can be used to justify prejudice and discrimination. At the same time, cannabis is entering American medicine through a completely different route. You observe a young Irish doctor named William Brooke O'Shaughnessy working in India in the 1830s as part of the British Colonial Medical Service. He investigates Indian cannabis use with genuine scientific curiosity, conducting experiments on animals and eventually treating human patients with cannabis preparations. His reports published in medical journals demonstrate that cannabis can provide remarkable pain relief, reduce muscle spasms in tetanus and rabies, and treat various other conditions. In 1841, he returns to England and introduces medicinal cannabis to Western medicine, bringing samples of Indian cannabis and advocating for its therapeutic use. American and European pharmaceutical companies take notice. By the mid-1800s, cannabis tinctures and extracts are commercially available in pharmacies across the United States and Europe. Drug companies like Parke-Davis, Eli Lilly, and Squibb manufacture standardized cannabis preparations sold as medicine for pain, insomnia, anxiety, and numerous other conditions. You can walk into a pharmacy in 1890 and purchase cannabis extract as easily as aspirin. More easily, actually, since aspirin won't be invented until 1899. This medical cannabis is mostly imported from India or grown from Indian cultivars, because American hemp varieties don't contain enough active compounds to be medicinally useful. So you have this strange situation where the United States is growing vast quantities of low-potency cannabis for fiber, while simultaneously importing high-potency cannabis for medicine, and most people don't realize these are the same species. The disconnect that started in Renaissance Europe persists and deepens in America. You observe a Victorian-era doctor prescribing cannabis tincture to a patient suffering from migraines. He adjusts the dose carefully, warns about potential side effects, and makes notes in his records about the treatment's effectiveness. This is a respectable medicine, legally prescribed and socially accepted, though it never becomes as popular as opium or morphine for pain management. Cannabis preparations are somewhat unpredictable. Different batches vary in potency, and the effects can be harder to control than injectable opiates. But for certain conditions and certain patients, cannabis works when other medicines fail. Then everything begins to shift. By the early 1900s, multiple forces converged to change how Americans think about cannabis. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 requires labeling of medicine contents, including cannabis, which is fine, regulation without prohibition. But darker currents are building. You notice increasing association of cannabis with Mexican immigrants, with black jazz musicians, with groups already marginalized and feared by white mainstream society. The temperance movement that will achieve alcohol prohibition is also targeting other intoxicants. Progressive-era reformers who believe they can perfect society through legislation and control are looking for new targets now that their anti-alcohol crusade is succeeding. Historians still argue about which factors mattered most in driving cannabis prohibition: racism, economic interests, medical concerns, moral panic, bureaucratic empire building. The reality is probably all of these together, reinforcing each other in a perfect storm of prohibition. But you're not quite there yet. For now, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, cannabis in America exists in multiple simultaneous realities: industrial hemp in Kentucky, medical tinctures in pharmacies, Mexican marijuana in the Southwest, possibly remnant African traditional use in black communities, and growing awareness among bohemians and adventurous sorts that cannabis can produce intoxication, similar to what travelers report from abroad. You sit in a pharmacy examining bottles of cannabis tincture, their labels promising relief from pain and nervous tension. In a few decades, these bottles will be banned, the medicine criminalized, the users transformed into criminals. But right now, they're simply products, neither more nor less remarkable than dozens of other plant-based remedies lining the shelves. The pharmacist recommends them casually, unaware that he's participating in a practice that will soon be remembered as either quaint medical history or dangerous drug abuse, depending on who's telling the story. The shift is coming, the great transformation that will change everything about how Americans and eventually much of the world relates to cannabis. But it hasn't arrived quite yet, and in this liminal moment, you can see all the possibilities that will soon be foreclosed by law, prejudice, and fear. You step into the late 19th and early 20th centuries now, a period when cannabis begins its transformation from accepted medicine to forbidden narcotic. The shift doesn't happen overnight. It's gradual, uneven, driven by forces that have little to do with the plant itself and everything to do with politics, racism, economic interests, and moral panic. You're watching the machinery of prohibition being constructed piece by piece, justified by claims that will prove remarkably durable despite their shaky relationship with truth. Victorian medicine is already moving away from plant-based preparations towards synthetic drugs and injectable opiates that offer more predictable effects. Aspirin arrives in 1899, offering reliable pain relief without cannabis's variable potency. Hypodermic syringes make morphine administration precise and immediate, which appeals to doctors seeking pharmaceutical control. Cannabis tinctures, with their inconsistent strength and delayed effects, start to seem old-fashioned, imprecise, holdovers from a less scientific age. The pharmaceutical companies that once manufactured cannabis preparations gradually lose interest as newer, more profitable drugs emerge. But the real driver of cannabis prohibition isn't medical, it's social and racial. You watch as newspapers begin publishing sensational stories about cannabis, often called marijuana now, a term deliberately chosen to emphasize its foreignness, its Mexicanness. The stories follow a template. Marijuana makes users violent, crazy, sexually promiscuous, and dangerous. It causes crime, insanity, and moral degradation. And crucially, the stories almost always focus on Mexican immigrants and Black Americans as the primary users and threat. You read headlines from the 1920s and 1930s, each one more lurid than the last. Marijuana makes fiends of boys in 30 days. Murder weed found up and down coast, deadly marijuana dope plant ready for harvest. These aren't factual reports, they're propaganda, fear-mongering designed to exploit existing prejudices and create new ones. The El Paso Herald runs stories about Mexicans smoking marijuana and becoming violent criminals. Other papers focus on black jazz musicians using reefer and corrupting white youth with their music and drugs. A man named Harry Anslinger emerges as the central figure in cannabis prohibition. He becomes the first commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics in 1930, and he needs to justify his agency's existence and budget. With alcohol prohibition ending in 1933, the drug enforcement apparatus needs a new enemy, and Anslinger chooses marijuana. You watch him testify before Congress, delivering speeches filled with racism barely disguised as concern for public safety. There are 100,000 total marijuana smokers in the US, and most are Negroes, Hispanics, Filipinos, and entertainers, he tells lawmakers. Their satanic music, jazz and swing, result from marijuana usage. Anslinger collects stories, he calls them his gore file, of crimes supposedly caused by marijuana. Most are unverified anecdotes, or cases where marijuana use is assumed without evidence. One frequently repeated story claims that a young man named Victor Licata murdered his family with an axe while under marijuana's influence, though later investigation will reveal Licata had been diagnosed with serious mental illness before ever using cannabis. The truth doesn't matter, the story is too useful, too perfectly crafted to generate fear. You observe the testimony of medical experts who push back against Anslinger's claims. The American Medical Association representative, Dr. William Woodward, argues that there's insufficient evidence that marijuana causes the problems attributed to it, and that prohibition will hamper medical research. His testimony is ignored or dismissed. The political momentum has already built beyond the point where facts matter. Congress isn't interested in nuanced debate about cannabis pharmacology. They want to protect white America from the threatening foreign drug and the threatening foreign people associated with it. The Marijuana Tax Act passes in 1937, effectively criminalizing cannabis at the federal level through prohibitively expensive taxation and licensing requirements. The spelling with an H, marijuana instead of marijuana, is deliberate, chosen to make the drug sound more foreign and threatening. Most Americans don't even realize that this marijuana is related to the hemp their grandparents grew, or the cannabis tinctures that were recently available in pharmacies. Anslinger has successfully rebranded cannabis as an alien threat, severing it from its American agricultural and medical history. State laws follow the federal lead, many of them even harsher. By the 1940s, cannabis possession can bring multi-year prison sentences in many states. The penalties fall disproportionately on people of color, just as the prohibition's architects intended. You watch as young men, predominantly black and brown, are arrested for possession of small amounts of marijuana, while white users are often ignored or treated more leniently. The pattern that will characterize cannabis prohibition for decades is already established. laws nominally about drugs but enforced as tools of racial control. What's remarkable is how quickly and thoroughly cannabis's image transforms. In one generation, it goes from accepted medicine to dangerous narcotic, from agricultural staple to contraband. The speed of this transformation suggests it was never really about the plant itself. Cannabis didn't change. Social and political attitudes changed, shaped by deliberate campaigns of misinformation and fear-mongering. Historians still argue about Anslinger's motivations. Was he a true believer in his anti-cannabis crusade, or a cynical bureaucrat building his empire? The answer probably contains elements of both, along with genuine racist beliefs that were socially acceptable in his era. You sit in a movie theater watching Reefer Madness, the 1936 propaganda film that will become unintentionally hilarious to later generations, but was intended as serious anti-drug education. On screen, wholesome teenagers take a puff of marijuana and within minutes descend into violence, insanity, and death. The acting is melodramatic, the plot absurd, but the message is clear and reflects widely believed claims. Marijuana transforms normal people into dangerous maniacs. The film plays to packed audiences, reinforcing fears that Anslinger and others have so carefully cultivated. Meanwhile, the people actually using cannabis, and there are more than Anslinger's estimates suggest, are forced underground. Jazz musicians in Harlem, Mexican workers in the Southwest, bohemians and artists experimenting with consciousness, all now criminals subject to arrest and imprisonment. The social networks and cultural knowledge around cannabis use don't disappear under prohibition, but they become hidden, fragmentary, vulnerable to disruption. Knowledge that was once passed openly now travels in whispers, seeds, and plants hidden from police. The entire culture of cannabis use transformed into something furtive and dangerous. The medical research that Dr. Woodward worried about does indeed stall. Cannabis prohibition makes it nearly impossible to conduct serious scientific studies of the plant's effects, benefits, or risks. The questions that Victorian doctors were beginning to explore: which conditions respond to cannabis? What doses are effective? What are the actual dangers versus hysterical claims? These questions become unanswerable for decades because the political and legal climate makes research impossible. Science is replaced by propaganda, and the gap between official claims about marijuana and the lived experience of actual users grows into a chasm that will eventually undermine prohibition's credibility. You watch the final pieces of the prohibition apparatus fall into place. International pressure from the United States pushes other countries towards similar laws. The 1961 Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs, heavily influenced by American drug warriors, creates a global framework for cannabis prohibition that will persist for decades. What began as racist American moral panic becomes internationalized, imposed on countries with their own long histories of cannabis use, disrupting traditional practices from Morocco to India to Jamaica. As the 1930s fade into the 1940s and World War II, you realize you've witnessed a pivotal transformation. Cannabis has been redefined from multiple perspectives: medicine, industrial fiber, cultural practice, into a single monolithic threat. The complexity and nuance of humanity's long relationship with the plant has been flattened into simplistic narratives of danger and degeneracy. And this flattening, this reduction of complexity to propaganda, will shape cannabis policy for the next 80 years, causing immeasurable harm to millions of people arrested, imprisoned, and marginalized for their relationship with a plant that humans have used for thousands of years. The machinery of prohibition, once built, proves remarkably difficult to dismantle, even when its foundations are exposed as prejudice and lies. You brace yourself for what comes next, knowing the story grows darker before it finds any light. You move forward now into the mid-20th century, where cannabis prohibition is fully established, but a subversive undercurrent begins to swell. Despite decades of propaganda and harsh criminal penalties, people continue using cannabis, and new communities discover it, transforming it into a symbol of resistance against the very social order that criminalized it. You're entering jazz clubs shrouded in smoke, beatnik coffee houses where poetry mingles with marijuana, and eventually the explosive countercultural movements of the 1960s that will challenge everything about American society, including its drug laws. The story picks up in the 1940s and 50s in places like Harlem, New Orleans, and Kansas City, where jazz musicians create revolutionary music while often using marijuana. The connection between jazz and cannabis runs deep. Musicians report that marijuana enhances their perception of music, helps them hear harmonics and rhythms with greater clarity, facilitates the creative improvisation that defines jazz. Louis Armstrong is an enthusiastic cannabis user throughout his life, calling it an assistant, a friend, and far superior to alcohol, which he despises. Mez Mesro, a jazz clarinetist, becomes so associated with marijuana dealing that Mez becomes slang for high-quality cannabis. You slip into a Harlem jazz club after midnight, the air thick with cigarette and marijuana smoke. On stage, a quartet works through a complex improvisation, the musicians locked into a groove that seems almost telepathic in its coordination. Between sets, joints circulate backstage, passed between players who swear that cannabis helps them reach deeper into the music, helps them take risks and find connections they might otherwise miss. Whether marijuana actually enhances musical ability is something historians still debate, but what matters is that the musicians believe it does, and that belief shapes their culture and creative process. But this association between cannabis and black musical culture becomes another tool for prohibition enforcement. Police raid jazz clubs, arrest musicians for possession, and use marijuana charges to harass and control black entertainers who challenge social boundaries. Billie Holiday faces repeated arrests. Gene Krupa, a white drummer who crosses racial lines to play with black musicians, is arrested for marijuana possession in a highly publicized case that's clearly meant as punishment for his boundary crossing as much as for the drug itself. The pattern repeats endlessly, cannabis prohibition providing convenient pretext for targeting people and communities that mainstream white society wants to control. The 1950s bring the beatniks, literary rebels who reject post-war American conformity and materialism. Writers like Allen Ginsberg, Jack Kerouac, and William Burroughs use cannabis, peyote, and other drugs as tools for expanding consciousness and challenging conventional perception. Ginsberg in particular becomes an outspoken advocate for cannabis legalization, writing essays that mock the absurdity of prohibition and challenge the propaganda that justified it. His poem Howl captures a generation's alienation, and cannabis weaves through the culture he represents, not as the central point, but as one element of a broader rejection of 1950s respectability. You sit in a San Francisco coffee house in 1955, listening to poetry read over bongo drums while patrons sip espresso and occasionally slip outside to share joints in the alley. The vibe is deliberately transgressive. These people know they're breaking laws and social norms, and that's part of the point. Cannabis use becomes a marker of outsider status, a signal that you've rejected mainstream values. It's not just about getting high, it's about refusing to accept authority's right to dictate consciousness itself. Then the 1960s explode, and cannabis moves from the margins toward the center of youth culture. The civil rights movement, anti-war protests, women's liberation, and general questioning of authority create a cultural moment where young people are primed to reject their parents' values, including their drug attitudes. Cannabis, long associated with marginalized communities, suddenly becomes fashionable among white middle-class college students. The demographics of cannabis users shift dramatically, and this shift will eventually matter enormously for policy debates. You find yourself at a 1967 San Francisco gathering. The Human Being in Golden Gate Park, where tens of thousands of young people gather to celebrate peace, love, and consciousness expansion. Cannabis smoke hangs in the air openly, a mass act of civil disobedience. Timothy Leary is here, the former Harvard psychologist who's become a guru of consciousness exploration, famous for advocating psychedelics but also defending cannabis as a sacrament and tool for personal growth. Turn on, tune in, drop out becomes a slogan that terrifies mainstream America. The idea that their children might reject the entire social program of career, consumption, and conformity. The counterculture embraces cannabis as sacred herb, natural medicine, and symbol of everything the establishment opposes. Where Anslinger associated marijuana with violence and degeneracy, hippies associate it with peace, creativity, and spiritual insight. Both sides are probably exaggerating, projecting their own values onto a plant that simply does what plants do, produces chemical compounds that happen to affect human consciousness. But in the polarized atmosphere of the 1960s, cannabis becomes a battlefield in a larger cultural war about values, authority, and the future of American society. You watch as moral panic escalates to new heights. Parents discover their college-age children are using marijuana and react with horror shaped by decades of propaganda. Politicians recognize that being tough on drugs is politically advantageous, signaling that they're defending traditional values against hippie chaos. Richard Nixon will eventually declare a war on drugs in 1971, escalating enforcement and penalties, creating new enforcement agencies, and ensuring that cannabis prohibition becomes even more entrenched, despite growing evidence that marijuana is far less dangerous than claimed. But something else is happening too. The disconnect between official claims and user experience is becoming impossible to ignore. When middle-class white college students try marijuana and don't go insane, don't become violent, don't experience the horrors promised by reefer madness, they start questioning other government claims. If they lied about marijuana, what else are they lying about? Vietnam? Civil rights? The generation gap widens into a chasm, with cannabis prohibition becoming one of many issues where young people lose faith in their elders' wisdom. You observe the first serious challenges to prohibition emerging. In 1972, the Schaefer Commission, created by Nixon to study marijuana, recommends decriminalizing personal possession, concluding that cannabis is far less harmful than previously claimed. Nixon ignores the Commission's findings. He created it expecting validation of his drug war, not recommendation for reform. But the fact that a serious government commission reached this conclusion signals a shift in expert consensus, even if political consensus remains frozen in prohibitionist positions. Historians still argue about why the counterculture embraced cannabis so enthusiastically. Some point to genuine therapeutic and consciousness-expanding properties that users discovered through direct experience. Others emphasize the symbolic dimensions, cannabis as rebellion, as rejection of authority, as group identity marker. The answer is probably both and more. People use drugs for multiple overlapping reasons that resist simple categorization. What's clear is that by the late 1960s, cannabis use in America has exploded beyond anything Anslinger could have imagined, with millions of users despite decades of criminalization. As the 1960s fade into the 1970s, you notice the landscape shifting in complicated ways. Some states begin decriminalizing small amounts of marijuana, treating possession as a civil violation rather than criminal offense. Oregon leads the way in 1973, followed by other states. This isn't legalization. Selling and growing remain serious crimes, but it's a crack in prohibition's wall, an acknowledgement that arresting cannabis users isn't solving anything and is probably causing more harm than the drug itself. Yet simultaneously, the war on drugs intensifies. Penalties for trafficking increase, and enforcement becomes more militarized. Police use cannabis laws to justify aggressive tactics. No-knock raids, asset forfeiture, surveillance, that expand their power while supposedly fighting drugs. The contradiction persists, growing acceptance of casual use alongside increasingly harsh prohibition enforcement. You realize you're watching a conflict that won't resolve quickly, where progress and backlash coexist in uncomfortable tension. You stand at a crossroads in cannabis history, looking back at jazz clubs and forward toward debates still raging decades later. The plant that arrived in America as colonial hemp fiber has been transformed into a countercultural symbol, a tool of political repression, a generator of criminal fortunes, and for millions of users, simply a relatively mild intoxicant they enjoy, despite its illegal status. The story is far from over. In fact, some of the most dramatic chapters are still to come, but you need to catch your breath after witnessing such rapid transformation, such collision of cultures and values around a plant that keeps refusing to fit into the simple categories humans try to impose on it. You shift forward again, entering the late 20th century, where scientific understanding of cannabis finally begins to catch up with thousands of years of human use. After decades when prohibition made research nearly impossible, a few determined scientists start unlocking the plant's molecular secrets, discovering not just what cannabis does, but how it does it, and in the process, revealing something profound about human biology itself. You're standing at the threshold of discoveries that will reshape medicine and neuroscience, even as the political and legal battles over cannabis continue to rage. The breakthrough begins in 1964 when Israeli chemist Raphael Mechoulam isolates and synthesizes THC, tetrahydrocannabinol, the primary psychoactive compound in cannabis. This is the first time anyone has identified the specific molecule responsible for marijuana's effects, pulling it out from the complex mixture of hundreds of compounds that cannabis contains. Mechoulam's work is painstaking, requiring kilograms of confiscated Lebanese hashish provided by Israeli police. He purifies, tests, and finally identifies the structure of THC, giving scientists their first clear target for understanding cannabis pharmacology. You watch Mechoulam and his team feed pure THC to rhesus monkeys, observing the animals become calm and sedated. Clear evidence that this single compound can produce cannabis-like effects. When they give THC to human volunteers, the results are unmistakable. The feelings of relaxation, altered time perception, heightened sensory awareness, and occasional anxiety that cannabis users have reported for millennia. After thousands of years of human cannabis use, science finally knows which molecule is primarily responsible, and that knowledge opens doors that have been locked since prohibition began. But identifying THC raises more questions than it answers. How does this molecule work? Why do humans have receptors that respond to a compound produced by a plant? The answers won't come for another 2 decades, requiring advances in neuroscience and molecular biology that didn't exist in the 1960s. You fast forward to 1988, watching as researchers at the St. Louis University School of Medicine discover the first cannabinoid receptor in rat brains. They name it CB1, and its discovery is revolutionary. There are specific receptors in the brain that THC binds to, receptors that wouldn't exist unless they served some natural purpose. This discovery leads to the most profound revelation. Humans produce their own cannabis-like compounds. In 1992, Mechoulam's team identifies the first endogenous cannabinoid, anandamide, named from the Sanskrit word ananda, meaning bliss or joy. 2 years later, they discover a second one, 2-AG, 2-arachidonyl-glycerol. You're witnessing the discovery of what scientists will call the endocannabinoid system, a previously unknown biological system that exists in humans and almost all vertebrate animals, regulating everything from pain and mood to appetite, memory, and immune function. Think about what this means. Humans have an internal system of neurotransmitters and receptors that the cannabis plant happens to interact with. We didn't evolve these receptors to use cannabis. Cannabis works because it accidentally produces compounds similar to our own internal signaling molecules. It's like finding a key on the ground that happens to fit locks in your house. Pure biochemical coincidence, but one with profound consequences. The endocannabinoid system turns out to be one of the most widespread and important regulatory systems in the body, influencing countless physiological processes. You observe as researchers map cannabinoid receptors throughout the body and brain. CB1 receptors are densely concentrated in regions controlling movement, pain perception, memory, and emotion. CB2 receptors are found primarily in immune cells and peripheral tissues. The distribution helps explain cannabis's diverse effects, why it can reduce pain, stimulate appetite, impair short-term memory, affect coordination, and influence immune responses. Every effect corresponds to receptors in relevant brain regions or body systems. The scientific momentum builds through the 1990s and 2000s despite continued prohibition obstacles. Researchers discover that the endocannabinoid system works differently from other neurotransmitter systems. It's a retrograde system, meaning signals travel backward across synapses, from postsynaptic to presynaptic neurons. This makes it a master regulator, a system that modulates other systems, turning them up or down as needed. Endocannabinoids are produced on demand, synthesized when and where they're needed rather than stored in vesicles like most neurotransmitters. You watch as this knowledge revolutionizes understanding of cannabis's medical potential. If the endocannabinoid system regulates pain, then cannabinoids might treat chronic pain. If it influences appetite, then THC might help cancer patients who can't eat. If it modulates anxiety and stress responses, then cannabinoids might treat PTSD or anxiety disorders. The medical applications that ancient Chinese physicians and Victorian doctors recognized through empirical observation now have molecular explanations. But here's where politics and science collide uncomfortably. Even as research demonstrates therapeutic potential and reveals cannabis to be far less dangerous than Prohibition-era propaganda claimed, the drug remains classified as Schedule I under federal law, defined as having no accepted medical use and high potential for abuse. Historians still argue about how this obviously incorrect classification persisted for so long, but the answer involves bureaucratic inertia, political investment in prohibition, and the difficulty of admitting that drug policy has been catastrophically wrong for decades. You observe researchers struggling with absurd obstacles. To study cannabis legally in the United States, they need DEA permission, which is rarely granted. The only legal source of research cannabis is a single government farm at the University of Mississippi, producing material of notoriously poor quality that doesn't reflect the potency or variety of cannabis actually used by patients and recreational users. The catch-22 is perfect. Prohibition prevents research that might demonstrate medical value, and the absence of research is used to justify continued prohibition because there's insufficient evidence of medical value. Some scientists work around these obstacles by studying cannabis in countries with more permissive research environments. Israel, Canada, the Netherlands. Others focus on synthetic cannabinoids or isolated compounds rather than whole plant cannabis. The research proceeds despite obstacles, gradually accumulating evidence that challenges prohibition narratives. Studies show that cannabis has legitimate medical applications for chronic pain, nausea, muscle spasticity, and other conditions. Research demonstrates that cannabis is far less toxic than alcohol or opiates, with no recorded deaths from overdose despite millions of users. The discovery of the endocannabinoid system also opens research into what happens when this system malfunctions. You learn about clinical endocannabinoid deficiency, a controversial hypothesis that some conditions, including migraines, fibromyalgia, and irritable bowel syndrome, might result from insufficient endocannabinoid signaling. If true, supplementing with plant cannabinoids could correct the deficiency, explaining why some patients report dramatic relief from cannabis when conventional medicines failed. The hypothesis remains debated, but it represents the kind of sophisticated thinking that becomes possible once the underlying biology is understood. You watch as pharmaceutical companies develop synthetic cannabinoids and cannabis-derived medications. Marinol, a synthetic THC pill, receives FDA approval in 1985 for nausea and appetite loss. Sativex, a whole plant cannabis extract delivered as an oral spray, is approved in Canada and several other countries for multiple sclerosis spasticity. Epidiolex, a purified CBD preparation, receives FDA approval in 2018 for severe epilepsy. These pharmaceutical cannabinoids exist in strange legal and cultural space, acceptable as FDA-approved medicines yet derived from or mimicking a Schedule I drug that supposedly has no medical value. The scientific progress creates cognitive dissonance that becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. How can cannabis simultaneously have no medical value and be the source of FDA-approved medications? How can it be classified alongside heroin for danger when research clearly shows it's far less harmful? The contradictions pile up until they become absurd, and public opinion begins to shift as scientific knowledge filters into mainstream awareness. Yet research gaps remain enormous because of decades of prohibition-imposed ignorance. Scientists still don't fully understand how different cannabinoids interact, the entourage effect where compounds work synergistically rather than in isolation. They're only beginning to explore minor cannabinoids beyond THC and CBD. Long-term effects of heavy use remain understudied. The questions that should have been answered decades ago are only now being seriously investigated, and catching up will take many more years of research. As you stand in a modern laboratory watching researchers analyze cannabinoid receptor signaling, you feel the weight of lost time. All the research that could have been done, all the patients who might have been helped, all the knowledge delayed by prohibition. But you also feel hope because science, however slowly, is revealing truth that politics cannot indefinitely suppress. The endocannabinoid system exists whether legislators acknowledge it or not. Cannabis has medical value regardless of its legal schedule, and truth, once established scientifically, has a way of eventually reshaping social and political reality, even when that reshaping takes frustratingly long to accomplish. You pull back now to see the global picture, because while scientific understanding was advancing, cannabis prohibition had spread worldwide, disrupting traditional cultures and creating black markets that generated violence, corruption, and immense human suffering. You're watching prohibition as an international system, imposed largely by American pressure but adapted and enforced by governments around the world, often with devastating consequences for the very communities whose traditional cannabis use predates prohibition by centuries or millennia. The architecture of global prohibition centers on United Nations treaties, particularly the 1961 Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs and its successors. These treaties, heavily influenced by American drug warriors, require signatory nations to criminalize cannabis production, distribution, and possession. You observe diplomats from dozens of countries signing documents that will reshape their domestic policies, often against their own cultural traditions and better judgment. Countries with long histories of cannabis use, India, Morocco, Jamaica, Thailand, are pressured to criminalize practices that were previously normal, legal, and culturally integrated. You travel to India first, where cannabis has been sacred and medicinal for millennia. The 1961 convention technically allows religious and traditional uses, but Indian law implementing the treaty creates confusion and inconsistency. Bhang remains legal in most of India, classified as different from marijuana and hashish, despite being the same plant. You watch as this legal distinction creates absurdities. Preparations from leaves are tolerated while flowering tops are criminalized, even though both come from cannabis and both have been traditional for thousands of years. Police raid ganja sellers while bhang shops operate openly next door, the line between legal and illegal determined by arbitrary botanical distinctions rather than coherent policy. The impact on traditional users is profound. Communities that cultivated cannabis for generations face criminalization. Knowledge that was passed down openly now must be hidden. The Naga sadhus, wandering holy men who've smoked cannabis as religious practice for centuries, continue their traditions but now risk arrest. The disconnect between law and culture creates a kind of social schizophrenia where everyone knows that cannabis use continues, but officially it's forbidden, creating opportunities for police corruption and selective enforcement that targets the poor and marginalized. You fly to Jamaica next, where cannabis, called ganja, a term with Indian origins, arrived with indentured laborers from India in the 19th century and became deeply integrated into Rastafarian religion and Jamaican culture more broadly. Rastafarians consider ganja a sacrament, essential for meditation and spiritual insight, directly tied to their religious identity. Yet British colonial law criminalized it in 1913, long before Rastafari emerged, and independent Jamaica maintained prohibition under international treaty obligations and American pressure. The result is decades of tension. You watch Jamaican police raid poor neighborhoods, arrest ganja users, and fill prisons with people whose crime is using a plant their ancestors used for generations. Meanwhile, international tourists consume ganja relatively freely, creating two-tier enforcement where locals suffer while foreigners are tolerated. The Rastafarians resist, arguing for religious freedom, but their claims are dismissed or ignored. Bob Marley becomes an international icon, his music inseparable from ganja culture, yet the substance central to his spiritual practice remains criminalized in his homeland. Morocco presents another variation on the prohibition theme. The Rif Mountains have grown cannabis for centuries, probably since Arab traders introduced it around the 7th century. By the 20th century, keef, cannabis mixed with tobacco and smoked in long pipes, is traditional throughout Morocco, and hashish production in the Rif supports entire communities economically. But prohibition forces this economy underground, creating a massive black market controlled by organized crime and corrupt officials. You watch as Moroccan cannabis farmers become criminals in their own country, their traditional crop redefined as contraband even as it remains the only viable way to make a living in the impoverished mountains. The international drug war affects Morocco in complicated ways. European demand for hashish creates profitable markets, so cultivation expands despite criminalization. The Moroccan government occasionally cracks down, burning fields and arresting farmers, but enforcement is sporadic and often motivated by political considerations rather than drug policy logic. Meanwhile, the criminalization ensures that profits flow to organized crime rather than legitimate businesses or government tax revenue. Historians still argue about whether Moroccan hashish production would have been better managed through regulation than through failed prohibition that enriched criminals while impoverishing farmers. You travel to Thailand, where cannabis has traditional use in medicine and cuisine, leaves flavoring curries, seeds pressed for oil, the plant grown in household gardens for various purposes. Thai law criminalized cannabis in 1934, possibly influenced by the same League of Nations pressures that drove prohibition elsewhere, and penalties become extraordinarily harsh. By the late 20th century, Thailand has some of the world's strictest drug laws, with long prison sentences or even death penalty for trafficking. The traditional knowledge fragments and goes underground, surviving primarily in rural areas where enforcement is lighter. The pattern repeats across the globe. Traditional cannabis cultures disrupted or destroyed by prohibition, black markets emerging to serve continuing demand, enforcement falling heaviest on poor and marginalized populations, while wealthy users face fewer consequences. In Mexico, cannabis prohibition fuels cartel violence as criminal organizations fight over profitable drug routes to the United States. In Afghanistan, cannabis cultivation continues alongside opium production, providing income for farmers in regions where few other crops grow successfully. In Africa, cannabis remains widely used despite criminalization, with enforcement sporadic and often corrupt. The human cost is staggering. Millions of people are arrested, imprisoned, or killed because of cannabis prohibition. Families are separated when parents go to prison for possession. Criminal records destroy employment prospects. In some countries, people are executed for cannabis trafficking. The war on drugs, as Nixon called it, becomes an actual war in places like Mexico and Colombia, with military forces deployed against drug cartels, civilians caught in the crossfire, and entire regions destabilized by the violence that prohibition generates. You witness American drug enforcement operations abroad, DEA agents working with local police, military aid conditioned on drug war cooperation, coca and cannabis fields sprayed with herbicides that also poison legal crops and water supplies. The United States exports its drug war globally, pressuring other nations to adopt American-style prohibition, regardless of whether those policies make sense in local contexts. Countries that resist American pressure face economic and political consequences, creating a system where drug policy becomes a tool of international power projection. But resistance persists. The Netherlands develops a pragmatic tolerance policy in the 1970s, allowing cannabis sales in licensed coffee shops while technically maintaining prohibition. The policy is imperfect, a backdoor problem where supply remains illegal, even as retail sales are tolerated. But it demonstrates that alternatives to harsh criminalization are possible. Cannabis use rates in the Netherlands don't explode, society doesn't collapse, the sky doesn't fall. This becomes a crucial data point for legalization advocates elsewhere. Permissive cannabis policy doesn't necessarily lead to disaster. Spain develops cannabis social clubs, a legal grey area where private cultivation and consumption for members avoids public dealing laws. Switzerland, Portugal, and other European nations experiment with decriminalization, treating possession as administrative violation rather than crime. These European experiments proceed despite the international treaty framework, interpreted flexibly or simply ignored when domestic policy priorities conflict with prohibition dogma. You notice a pattern. Wealthy Western nations can experiment with reform relatively freely, while poorer nations face intense pressure to maintain strict prohibition. The same American government that eventually tolerates state-level cannabis legalization within its own borders continues demanding that other countries maintain criminalization. The hypocrisy becomes increasingly difficult to ignore, and international consensus on cannabis prohibition begins to crack. By the early 21st century, Uruguay and Canada will fully legalize cannabis despite international treaty obligations, demonstrating that the prohibition consensus is collapsing. But you're not quite there yet. You're still in the era when prohibition reigns globally, when the human cost continues mounting, when traditional cannabis cultures struggle to survive under criminalization, and when the gap between policy and reality grows ever wider. The resistance to prohibition is building, pressure accumulating like water behind a failing dam, but the breakthrough moment hasn't quite arrived. You brace yourself for what's coming next, knowing that the story accelerates from here, that decades of failed prohibition are about to confront a wave of reform that will reshape the entire landscape of cannabis law and culture. You step into the late 20th and early 21st centuries now, where prohibition begins to crack under the weight of its own failures and contradictions. The change starts slowly, almost imperceptibly, with medical marijuana laws that seem modest but open floodgates that prohibition advocates can never quite close again. You're watching the beginning of the end of cannabis prohibition, a transformation that's still incomplete and contested but gathering unstoppable momentum as public opinion shifts and the lies that justified criminalization become impossible to maintain. The modern medical marijuana movement emerges from the AIDS crisis of the 1980s and early 1990s. You observe desperately sick patients discovering that cannabis helps with the nausea from AIDS medications, stimulates appetite when wasting syndrome makes eating impossible, and provides relief when conventional medicines fail. These aren't hippies looking for legal highs. They're dying people seeking anything that might help them survive, and cannabis works when other options don't. The human face of medical need becomes impossible to ignore, creating sympathy that transcends the political polarization around drug policy. Dennis Perrone, a gay rights activist in San Francisco whose partner dies of AIDS, becomes a central figure. In 1991, he helps pass San Francisco's Proposition P, a non-binding resolution supporting medical marijuana access. The measure passes overwhelmingly, signaling that even in the midst of the drug war, voters can distinguish between recreational use and medical necessity. Perrone then works on a statewide initiative, drafting language for what will become California's Proposition 215. You watch the 1996 California election, where Proposition 215, the Compassionate Use Act, asks voters whether patients with serious illnesses should be allowed to use marijuana with a doctor's recommendation. The opposition is fierce. Law enforcement, anti-drug groups, and federal officials all campaign against it, warning of teenagers getting prescriptions, of medicine being diverted to recreational use, of California becoming a drug haven. But the measure passes with 56% of the vote, becoming the first major crack in prohibition's wall. The federal government responds with fury. You observe DEA raids on California dispensaries, arrests of patients and providers, federal prosecutors declaring that state law doesn't protect anyone from federal prohibition. The conflict between state and federal law creates years of confusion and chaos, with medical marijuana existing in legal limbo, permitted by state law, prohibited by federal law, with patients and providers never quite sure whether they're safe from arrest. But something profound has shifted. Once California broke the ice, other states follow. Arizona passes medical marijuana the same year as California, though it's delayed by implementation problems. Alaska, Oregon, and Washington pass medical marijuana laws in 1998. Maine follows in 1999. The dominoes continue falling. Colorado, Hawaii, Nevada, Montana, Vermont, Rhode Island. By the early 2000s, medical marijuana is spreading despite federal opposition, despite raids and arrests, despite the fact that nothing in federal law has changed. You visit a California dispensary in the early 2000s, a small storefront in Venice Beach or Oakland. Inside, the atmosphere is part pharmacy, part coffee shop. Shelves display various cannabis strains with names like OG Kush and Sour Diesel, each promising slightly different effects. Bud tenders, a new profession, help patients choose products for their conditions. Some patients clearly have serious illnesses, cancer, AIDS, multiple sclerosis. Others have vaguer complaints, back pain, anxiety, insomnia. The line between legitimate medical use and recreational use disguised as medical is blurry, and critics point to this ambiguity as proof that medical marijuana is just legalization by another name. Historians still argue about whether medical marijuana was primarily about compassion for patients or a strategic step toward full legalization. The answer is probably both, simultaneously. Many advocates genuinely wanted to help sick people while also seeing medical marijuana as politically achievable reform when full legalization wasn't. The strategy worked. Once people saw medical marijuana programs operating without societal collapse, opposition to broader reform became harder to maintain. The research that prohibition had stifled slowly resumes. As more states allow medical use, universities in those states can more easily conduct cannabis research. Studies demonstrate efficacy for chronic pain, for chemotherapy-induced nausea, for epilepsy, for PTSD. The evidence accumulates, making the Schedule I classification look increasingly absurd. How can substance be both Schedule I, no accepted medical use, and also prescribed by doctors in 23 states? The contradiction becomes glaring. You watch as cultural attitudes shift dramatically, especially among younger generations. Surveys show majorities supporting legalization, particularly among millennials who came of age seeing medical marijuana normalized and questioning why cannabis should be illegal when alcohol and tobacco aren't. The generational divide is stark. Older Americans who absorbed reefer madness propaganda remain skeptical, while younger people who've seen friends and family use cannabis without catastrophe wonder what the fuss is about. The racial justice dimension of reform becomes impossible to ignore. Data clearly shows that Black Americans are arrested for marijuana possession at far higher rates than white Americans despite similar usage rates. The disparity is stunning. In some states, Black people are 4 times or more likely to be arrested for cannabis than whites. As mass incarceration becomes recognized as crisis and systemic racism moves toward mainstream acknowledgement, cannabis prohibition is increasingly seen as a tool of racial oppression rather than public safety. In 2012, the floodgates truly open. Colorado and Washington both passed ballot measures legalizing recreational cannabis for adults. Not medical marijuana with prescriptions, but full legalization with regulated sales, taxation, and legal home cultivation. You watch election night as the results come in and advocates realize they've actually won. Prohibition advocates are stunned, unable to quite believe that American states are legalizing marijuana despite federal law, international treaties, and decades of drug war rhetoric. The federal response is cautious. Instead of sending tanks and DEA agents to shut down Colorado's legal market, the Obama administration issues guidance, the Cole Memo, essentially saying that if states implement strong regulatory systems, federal enforcement will be deprioritized. It's not legal approval, just strategic non-interference, but it's enough to allow Colorado and Washington to proceed with implementation. You visit a Colorado dispensary on January 1, 2014, the first day of legal recreational sales. The line stretches around the block, media crews, curious tourists, long-time cannabis users emerging from decades in the shadows. Inside, people can legally purchase cannabis for the first time in their lives without fear of arrest. Some cry. Others take selfies. It's historic, absurd, mundane, and revolutionary all at once. The cashier bags purchases, collects payment, and taxes are recorded just like any legal business. Prohibition, at least in Colorado, is over. The domino effect accelerates. Alaska, Oregon, and Washington, D.C. legalize in 2014. California, Massachusetts, Maine, and Nevada follow in 2016. Vermont legalizes through legislature rather than ballot measure. Michigan becomes the first Midwestern state to legalize. Illinois follows. State after state, the map turns green as prohibition retreats. Not uniformly, southern states resist, maintaining strict criminalization, but the direction of change is undeniable. Canada goes even further. In 2018, Canada legalizes cannabis nationally, becoming the first major Western country to end prohibition completely. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau fulfills a campaign promise, arguing that legalization protects young people better than prohibition and removes profits from organized crime. The implementation isn't perfect. Edibles are delayed, provincial regulations vary, the black market persists, but prohibition ends nationwide, creating a massive legal industry and a model other countries watch closely. Uruguay actually legalized first in 2013. though with government-controlled production and sales quite different from North American models. Other Latin American countries begin reconsidering prohibition. Mexico's Supreme Court rules prohibition unconstitutional, though implementation stalls in the legislature. Ecuador decriminalizes. Colombia allows medical use. The prohibition consensus that once seemed immovable is dissolving, replaced by experimentation with multiple regulatory models. You observe the strange patchwork that results. Some countries fully legal, some medical only, some decriminalized, some maintaining harsh prohibition, and in the United States, a crazy quilt of state laws operating in defiance of federal prohibition that remains unchanged. The legal ambiguity creates problems but also possibilities. Cannabis businesses can't use banks because of federal law, but operate openly in legal states. People can possess cannabis legally under state law while technically violating federal law. The contradictions are absurd but perhaps necessary. Messy federalism experimenting toward better policy. The economic transformation is staggering. Legal cannabis becomes a multi-billion-dollar industry almost overnight. Dispensaries proliferate. Cultivation facilities sprawl across acres. Extraction companies produce concentrates and edibles. Testing laboratories analyze potency and contaminants, and specialized lawyers, accountants, and consultants serve the industry. Tax revenue flows into state coffers, hundreds of millions annually in larger states, funding schools, infrastructure, and drug treatment programs. Legal cannabis creates thousands of jobs, from bud tenders to cultivators to researchers, but problems emerge too. Corporate consolidation threatens to create cannabis monopolies. Some communities that suffered most under prohibition are excluded from legal markets by licensing barriers and startup costs. Edibles packaged like candy worry child safety advocates. Driving under cannabis influence remains legally ambiguous since impairment testing lags behind alcohol breathalyzers. Addiction specialists note that while cannabis is less addictive than many substances, it's not risk-free, and commercialization might increase problem use. The transition from prohibition to legalization is messy, incomplete, and contested. As you stand at the threshold of the 2020s, watching legalization spread but prohibition persisting in many places, you realize the story isn't finished. Federal prohibition remains in the United States despite majority state-level reform. Most countries still criminalize cannabis. Millions remain in prison for what's now legal activity. The social and racial harms of prohibition continue even as reform advances. The cannabis story is entering a new chapter, but chapters remain to be written, battles to be fought, and questions to be answered about how legalization should work, who benefits, and whether this reformation can repair the damage prohibition caused. Let me adjust to meet the target. You take a breath, watching this transformation unfold, knowing there's still so much ahead. You arrive in the present moment now, standing in a landscape transformed yet still deeply contested. Cannabis legalization continues spreading, but the debates have evolved beyond simple prohibition versus permission into complex questions about how legalization should work, who benefits from legal markets, and whether reform can address the injustices prohibition created. You're watching cannabis culture and commerce emerge into daylight after decades underground, bringing both promise and problems that nobody fully anticipated. The legal cannabis industry in North America has exploded into something that would have seemed impossible just a generation ago. You walk into a modern dispensary, nothing like the sketchy storefronts of early medical marijuana days. This place resembles an Apple store crossed with a boutique pharmacy. All sleek design, knowledgeable staff in branded uniforms, and products displayed like premium consumer goods. Glass cases showcase flower in dozens of strains, each with detailed information about cannabinoid content, terpene profiles, and intended effects. Another section offers edibles, gummies, chocolates, beverages, even cannabis-infused olive oil. Vape pens promise discreet consumption, Topical creams claim to relieve pain without intoxication. The sophistication is remarkable and slightly unsettling. Cannabis has gone from counterculture to consumer culture, from rebellion to retail. You notice the prices, sometimes lower than black market but often higher, reflecting taxes that can reach 30 or 40% in some jurisdictions. The tax revenue is substantial, billions of dollars annually across legal states, funding everything from schools to homeless services to substance abuse treatment. Prohibition advocates predicted disaster. Instead, states gained revenue and jobs while arrests plummeted. But you also notice who's absent. The bud tenders are mostly young and white. The ownership, when you investigate, is predominantly white and male, often people with business backgrounds and startup capital. The communities that suffered most under Prohibition, black and brown neighborhoods where enforcement was harshest, where generations were arrested and incarcerated, are largely excluded from legal markets. Licensing requirements, background checks that disqualify people with prior cannabis convictions, and startup costs running into hundreds of thousands of dollars create barriers that keep out the very people who paid the highest price for Prohibition. Some jurisdictions try to address this through social equity programs, priority licensing for people from over-policed communities, technical assistance for minority entrepreneurs, automatic expungement of cannabis convictions. Illinois, for example, reserves licenses for social equity applicants and uses tax revenue to support them. But implementation is messy, programs are underfunded, and powerful interests often find ways around equity requirements. You watch as big corporations, alcohol companies, tobacco firms, pharmaceutical giants buy into cannabis, bringing capital and expertise, but also threatening to replicate the same concentrated corporate control that dominates other vice industries. The question of corporate cannabis versus craft cannabis plays out in real time. Large companies want to standardize products, achieve economies of scale, and build national brands. They envision cannabis like beer, a few major producers dominating shelves with consistent products available everywhere. Small cultivators and activists envision something more like wine. Diverse producers, regional varieties, appreciation for craft and terroir. The tension between these visions shapes regulatory debates, with corporate interests pushing for rules that favor large operations, while craft advocates fight to preserve space for small producers. Medical marijuana patients find themselves in complicated positions. Legalization was supposed to help them, and in some ways it does. More products, more research, less stigma. But recreational legalization sometimes increases prices as demand surges and taxes stack up. Some states eliminate separate medical programs once recreational is legal, forcing patients into the same markets as recreational users. Other patients worry that commercialization is reducing cannabis to THC percentages and marketing gimmicks, losing traditional knowledge about whole plant medicine and the importance of minor cannabinoids and terpenes. You observe the evolution of cannabis products into forms ancient users wouldn't recognize. Concentrates now reach 90% THC or higher, far beyond the 5 to 15% in traditional cannabis flower. Edibles allow precise dosing but also create overdose risks when people consume too much before effects kick in. Synthetic cannabinoids designed to mimic natural compounds but with altered chemical structures flood the market with unpredictable effects and sometimes severe adverse reactions. The plant your ancestors knew has spawned an industry producing substances that bear only chemical relationship to traditional cannabis. Research is finally accelerating after decades of prohibition-imposed ignorance. You visit laboratories where scientists study cannabis's effects on PTSD, chronic pain, epilepsy, addiction, and dozens of other conditions. The FDA has approved Epidiolex for severe childhood epilepsy, a cannabis-derived medication that proves beyond doubt that the plant has legitimate medical applications. Other research explores how cannabis affects developing brains, whether it's addictive, what dosing guidelines make sense, and how different cannabinoids and terpenes interact in the entourage effect that whole plant advocates champion. But research faces persistent obstacles. Cannabis remains Schedule I federally in the United States, making research legally complicated and expensive. The disconnect between state legalization and federal prohibition creates absurdities. Researchers in Colorado can legally purchase cannabis from dispensaries under state law, but would violate federal law by using it in federally funded research. The situation is slowly improving, but decades of lost research time cannot be quickly recovered. Questions that should have been answered 50 years ago are only now being seriously investigated. The driving under influence question remains contentious. Unlike alcohol, where blood alcohol content correlates relatively well with impairment, THC levels don't predict impairment reliably. Regular users maintain high blood THC while functioning normally. Occasional users might be severely impaired with lower levels. No reliable roadside test exists equivalent to alcohol breathalyzers. Some jurisdictions set arbitrary THC blood limits, while others rely on officer observations of impairment. Historians still argue about whether cannabis-impaired driving is as dangerous as alcohol-impaired driving, with studies producing conflicting results partly because measuring cannabis impairment is methodologically difficult. The international picture remains fragmented. Canada's national legalization influenced other countries. Mexico, Luxembourg, Germany, and others are moving toward legal frameworks, though implementation timelines keep slipping. The United Nations has reclassified cannabis, removing it from Schedule I, most dangerous, while keeping it in Schedule I, still controlled. This is progress, sort of, but the international treaty system remains fundamentally prohibitionist, even as individual countries defect from that consensus. Meanwhile, many countries maintain harsh prohibition. In Singapore, cannabis possession can bring years in prison. Throughout much of Asia, the Middle East, and Africa, prohibition remains strict, often with penalties far exceeding those in the West. The global cannabis landscape is wildly uneven. Wealthy Western nations experimenting with legalization, while poorer nations face pressure to maintain criminalization, even when their own citizens want reform. You notice generational and political divides that cut across traditional party lines. Young conservatives often support legalization based on libertarian principles. Government shouldn't control what adults put in their bodies. Progressive activists support it for social justice and racial equity reasons. The coalition for reform is strange and unstable, united only by opposition to prohibition, but disagreeing about almost everything else regarding how legalization should work. The conversation has shifted in remarkable ways. A decade ago, the debate was whether to legalize. Now it's how to legalize, what regulations make sense, how to prevent youth access while allowing adult use, whether to allow home cultivation, how to tax and spend revenue, how to repair prohibition's damage. These are harder questions than simple prohibition versus legalization, requiring nuanced policy making rather than ideological positioning. You watch as politicians who built careers being tough on crime and tough on drugs now compete to position themselves as cannabis reform champions. The same Democratic Party that supported harsh drug laws in the 1980s and 90s now includes legalization in its platform. Republicans remain divided. Libertarian wings support legalization while law and order factions resist. But even resistance softens as legalization proves less catastrophic than predicted, and prohibition's costs become undeniable. The cultural transformation is equally profound. Cannabis has entered mainstream culture in ways that seemed impossible during the height of the drug war. Celebrities discuss cannabis use openly. Cannabis brands sponsor events. Cooking shows feature cannabis recipes. The plant that was demonized for generations is now just another consumer product, albeit one with age restrictions and regulations. The normalization is so complete that young people in legal states barely understand what the fuss was about. Of course, adults can use cannabis, just like alcohol or tobacco. So what? But do you remember the millions arrested, the families separated, the communities devastated by enforcement? The normalization, welcome as it is, sometimes feels like amnesia, society moving forward without fully reckoning with prohibition's costs or compensating its victims. Expungement programs exist but often require expensive legal help to navigate. People remain in prison for activities that are now legal and commercially profitable. The tension between celebration of legalization and acknowledgement of prohibition's ongoing harms creates ethical discomfort that the cannabis industry would rather not confront. As you stand in this present moment, watching the transformation still unfolding, you realize the cannabis story contains all the contradictions of human society: scientific progress and willful ignorance, compassion and cruelty, profit and justice, freedom and control. The plant that ancient peoples used ritually and medicinally has survived prohibition and emerged into legalization, carrying the weight of all that history. Where it goes from here, whether legalization spreads globally, whether corporate consolidation dominates, whether social equity succeeds or fails, whether medical research fulfills its promise, remains to be seen. The story continues, as messy and complicated as ever, resisting simple narratives or easy conclusions. Let me adjust. You take stock of where things stand, knowing the next chapter is already being written. You stand at the edge of the future now, looking forward into possibilities that remain uncertain and contested. Cannabis prohibition is retreating but not defeated. Legalization is spreading but incomplete. The questions that remain are perhaps more complex than the ones already answered, because they require not just changing laws, but transforming culture, repairing damage, and deciding what kind of relationship humanity wants with this ancient plant going forward. You're watching the beginning of something new, though what exactly it becomes depends on choices not yet made. The momentum toward broader legalization seems unstoppable in much of the Western world. More American states continue adding legal cannabis to their ballots and legislatures. Conservative states like Montana and South Dakota have approved medical programs, suggesting even traditional prohibition strongholds are reconsidering. Federal legalization in the United States inches closer, with bills introduced in Congress, though partisan gridlock and bureaucratic inertia slow progress. The question isn't whether federal prohibition will end, but when and how, with details about taxation, regulation, and interstate commerce still hotly debated. Internationally, the dominoes keep falling at different speeds. Germany has moved toward legalization, though implementation faces legal challenges. Mexico's path forward remains tangled in legislative delays despite Supreme Court rulings. Thailand surprised observers by legalizing cannabis in 2022, becoming the first Asian nation to do so, though the program's future remains uncertain amid political instability. Each country experiments with different models: government monopoly in some places, private markets in others, social clubs, pharmacy sales, varying tax structures and regulations. The global laboratory produces data that will shape future policy, showing what works and what creates problems. The medical research pipeline is fuller than ever, with studies investigating cannabis for everything from Alzheimer's to inflammation to addiction treatment. Early results suggest promise for conditions like PTSD and chronic pain, potentially offering alternatives to opioids that have fueled devastating addiction crises. But researchers caution against over-enthusiasm. Cannabis isn't a miracle cure, and responsible science requires rigorous testing, not just hopeful assumptions. The challenge is separating legitimate medical potential from marketing hype in an industry financially motivated to exaggerate benefits. You observe debates about potency and product safety that will shape cannabis's future. Some jurisdictions consider capping THC levels, worried that ultra-high potency products increase risks of adverse psychological effects, dependency, and cannabis hyperemesis syndrome, a poorly understood condition where heavy users experience severe cyclical vomiting. The cannabis industry resists potency limits, arguing that consumers should have choice and that regulation should focus on education rather than prohibition by another name. Historians still argue about whether high-potency cannabis represents genuine public health concern or moral panic reminiscent of Prohibition-era fear-mongering. The social equity question looms large, unresolved, and increasingly urgent. As corporate cannabis consolidates and wealthy investors profit enormously, the people who suffered under Prohibition remain largely excluded. Some advocates push for reparations, using cannabis tax revenue to compensate communities damaged by the drug war, funding education and economic development in over-policed neighborhoods, automatic clearing of all cannabis records without requiring individuals to navigate complex legal processes. Others argue that reparations, however morally justified, are politically impossible and that incremental reforms are the best achievable outcome. You watch as some formerly incarcerated cannabis activists launch their own businesses, their stories of resilience becoming marketing tools, brands built on authenticity that corporations can never quite replicate. These entrepreneurs face enormous challenges competing against well-funded companies, but they represent a vision of cannabis commerce that centers justice and community rather than pure profit maximization. Whether this vision can survive or will be overwhelmed by corporate consolidation remains uncertain. The environmental impact of cannabis cultivation is emerging as significant concern. Indoor growing consumes enormous energy, lights, climate control, dehumidification, creating substantial carbon footprints. Outdoor cultivation can strain water resources and harm ecosystems if not managed sustainably. California's legal market requires environmental compliance that illegal grows ignored, but enforcement is imperfect and black markets persist. The challenge is encouraging sustainable practices without creating regulations so burdensome that they drive producers back underground. International drug policy is slowly shifting beyond cannabis. Several countries have decriminalized all drugs, treating possession as a health issue rather than crime. Portugal's approach, implemented in 2001, shows that decriminalization doesn't increase use while dramatically reducing overdose deaths and HIV infections. Oregon voters approved drug decriminalization in 2020, though implementation faces challenges and political backlash. These experiments suggest that lessons from cannabis reform, that criminalization often causes more harm than the drugs themselves, might apply to drug policy broadly. But resistance persists and sometimes strengthens. Some communities that initially embraced legalization now express buyer's remorse, concerned about proliferating dispensaries, public consumption, and whether promised benefits materialized. Some states that legalized through ballot measures see legislators trying to roll back provisions or create more restrictive frameworks. The backlash isn't strong enough to reverse legalization, but it complicates the narrative of inevitable progress toward broader reform. You notice how cannabis normalization interacts with other substance use trends. Alcohol consumption is declining slightly, especially among young people, with some substituting cannabis. Tobacco smoking continues its long decline while nicotine vaping surges. Psychedelic drugs are being reconsidered for therapeutic potential, following cannabis's path from Schedule I prohibition toward medical acceptance. The entire landscape of intoxicants and consciousness-altering substances is being renegotiated, with cannabis as the leading edge of broader rethinking about prohibition, drug policy, and human autonomy. The cultural questions are perhaps most fascinating. What happens to cannabis culture, with its slang, rituals, identity, and countercultural associations, when the substance becomes mainstream consumer product? Does legalization erase the rebellious mystique that made cannabis appealing to generations of users? Or does it simply mature into something new, shedding the romantic mythology of prohibition while retaining community and ritual around consumption? Historians will debate whether legalization represents cannabis culture's victory or its death. And the answer probably depends on which aspects of that culture you value most. You think about the very beginning of this journey, standing on that Bronze Age plateau watching shamans burn cannabis in felt tents 5,000 years ago. The relationship between humans and this plant has been remarkably consistent across millennia and cultures. People seeking pain relief, spiritual insight, social bonding, creative inspiration, or simple pleasure through cannabis's effects on consciousness. What changed wasn't the plant or human desire, but the legal and moral framework societies constructed around that relationship. Prohibition was an aberration, historically speaking, barely a century of criminalization interrupting thousands of years of use. Now, as prohibition retreats, society is rediscovering knowledge that was suppressed but never entirely lost. Ancient physicians knew cannabis treated pain. Modern research confirms it. Traditional users knew different strains produced different effects. Contemporary science explains why through varying cannabinoid and terpene profiles. Indigenous peoples knew cannabis was relatively safe. Modern data shows far lower toxicity than alcohol or opioids. The future likely holds continued spread of legalization, gradual federal reform in the United States, international treaty revision, and ongoing debates about regulation details. Cannabis will become more normalized, more commercialized, more thoroughly researched. New products will emerge, targeted formulations for specific effects, pharmaceutical preparations for particular conditions, perhaps synthetic cannabinoids that improve on natural compounds. The industry will consolidate, mature, and integrate into the broader economy. But questions will persist. How to balance commercial interests with public health? How to repair prohibition's damage while moving forward? How to preserve traditional knowledge and craft cultivation in an industry trending corporate? How to prevent youth access without recreating prohibition? How to manage international disparities where some nations legalize while others maintain harsh penalties? These questions don't have easy answers, and the solutions will emerge through messy democratic processes, economic pressures, and cultural evolution. As you contemplate cannabis's future, you feel a strange mixture of hope and uncertainty. The end of prohibition represents justice, compassion, and reason finally prevailing over fear and prejudice. But legalization brings new challenges that prohibition's opponents warned about: commercialization, potency increases, impaired driving, potential impacts on developing brains. The task ahead is navigating these challenges without abandoning reform or reverting to prohibition, finding a middle path that acknowledges both cannabis's genuine risks and its unjustified demonization. You realize that cannabis, like humanity itself, defies simple categorization. It's medicine and intoxicant, sacred and mundane, relatively safe but not risk-free, individually liberating but socially complicated. The plant contains multitudes, reflecting back whatever humans project onto it: shamanic sacrament, dangerous narcotic, commercial commodity, social justice issue, medical breakthrough. All of these are true simultaneously, and none captures the whole truth. The story you've traced from ancient Central Asia to the present moment is ultimately a human story, about our relationship with plants and consciousness, about power and resistance, about how societies decide what's acceptable and what's forbidden. Cannabis happened to be the plant around which these dynamics played out. But the patterns, moral panic, racist enforcement, eventual reform, repeat with other substances and other behaviors throughout history. Perhaps the deepest lesson is humility. For thousands of years, people have used cannabis in ways that made sense within their cultures. The 20th century's certainty that prohibition was necessary and just has been revealed as arrogance, a claim to knowledge that wasn't justified by evidence. As legalization proceeds, a different kind of humility is needed, recognition that we still don't know everything about cannabis, that commercial legalization might create problems prohibition advocates warned about, that good intentions don't guarantee good outcomes. The cannabis story isn't ending, it's transforming, entering a new chapter whose contents remain unwritten. The plant that survived millennia of human use and a century of prohibition will continue adapting to whatever comes next, because cannabis is nothing if not resilient, versatile, and endlessly surprising. Where this journey leads depends on choices made by millions of people: voters, legislators, researchers, entrepreneurs, activists, and ordinary users, each contributing to a collective narrative still being composed. And as you stand at this threshold between prohibition's past and legalization's future, you feel the weight of all that history, all those lives touched by this remarkable plant, all the suffering prohibition caused and the hope legalization represents. The journey has been long, complex, and far from over, but at least now, finally, society is beginning to address cannabis with honesty rather than hysteria, with science rather than propaganda, with justice rather than persecution. The path forward won't be smooth or simple. There will be setbacks, mistakes, unintended consequences, and ongoing debates, but the direction is clear, toward a world where people can make informed choices about cannabis without fear of imprisonment, where medical research can proceed without prohibition's shackles, where communities harmed by the drug war receive something approaching justice, and where an ancient human relationship with a remarkable plant is finally freed from a century of unnecessary suffering. That's not a bad place to rest, not a bad note on which to let this history fade into the background as sleep slowly approaches and consciousness gently dissolves, carrying you toward dreams where perhaps cannabis smoke still curls from Bronze Age fires and the story continues in ways we can't yet imagine, but that somehow, mysteriously, feel both ancient and newly born, ending and beginning, complete and forever incomplete, just like the relationship between humans and this endlessly fascinating plant called cannabis. Your eyelids grow heavy now as this long journey through cannabis history draws to its close. You've traveled thousands of years, from prehistoric plateaus to modern dispensaries, tracing a single plant's remarkable journey through human civilization. So many cultures, so many uses, so many meanings layered one upon another like sediment, accumulating through millennia, until the simple question, when did people start smoking weed, revealed itself to be not simple at all but endlessly complex, branching into medicine and ritual, oppression and liberation, ignorance and understanding. Let the details fade now, all those names and dates and places dissolving into a softer awareness. What remains is perhaps just the feeling of connection, the recognition that you're part of an unbroken line stretching back to those first people who discovered that certain plants could change consciousness, could ease pain, could open doors in the mind to perceptions beyond the ordinary. They found something remarkable, and despite centuries of prohibition and persecution, that discovery was never completely lost, always preserved in underground cultures and traditional knowledge, waiting for a time when it might safely emerge again into daylight. The cannabis plant itself cares nothing for human laws and moral panics. It simply grows, as it has for millions of years before humans existed and will continue growing long after we're gone, producing its cannabinoids and terpenes for reasons of its own, according to evolutionary logic we only partly understand. That humans stumbled upon this plant and found its chemistry compatible with our own is pure chance, a cosmic accident that nevertheless shaped cultures and policies across the entire span of recorded history and beyond into prehistory where only archaeology can reach. Rest easy knowing that this long, difficult story is bending, however slowly, towards something better than prohibition, toward policies grounded in compassion and evidence, rather than fear and prejudice. toward repair of some of the damage criminalization caused, toward understanding of this ancient plant that's both more complicated and less dangerous than any simple narrative could capture. The work of reform continues, and tomorrow's challenges remain, but for tonight, let all of that go. Release your grip on questions that don't require immediate answers, and simply allow yourself to drift on the current of history itself, which flows in directions we can only partially control or predict. Your breathing slows and deepens now, matching the rhythms of sleep, while somewhere in the distance a cannabis plant grows silently, its leaves reaching toward sunlight, its flowers developing, its story continuing without need for human attention or concern, simply being what it is, neither good nor evil, neither medicine nor poison, but simply plant, ancient and contemporary, familiar and strange, ordinary and extraordinary, present in this moment and in all moments, stretching backward and forward through time until the distinction between past and future dissolves, and there's only this: breath, softness, darkness, peace, and the gentle knowledge that all stories, even the longest and most complicated, eventually find their ending, their moment of rest, their fading into silence and dreams and the deep, welcoming mystery of sleep, 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 mystery of